Standing down there, we can't really see.
I can't see either. I can see what you see. I don't know.
You don't even know how much of the building is left.
No, that's where we're going now to assess the condition.
All right,
thank you very much.
We understand you have emergency work to do. We appreciate it very much taking the time to put together a plan to go in there and just assess the damage. This sequence of extraordinary tragedies, this sequence of catastrophes, really, first the two crashes, and then in sequence, one tower of the building coming down, another tower of the building coming down. Obviously, the first order of business is to try to organize themselves and to go back in there in a way it doesn't endanger more emergency workers, because I can tell you, based on what I've seen, there have been a number of emergency workers who were put in harm's way this morning. They had to be, but the toll has to be extraordinary. Tom, we'll throw it back to you.
Thank you very much, Pat Dawson. Those are the first numbers that we've had this morning. They think there were about 20,000 people in the two buildings at the time of the attack, to say nothing of the untold number of people on the streets or in nearby buildings who could also have suffered injuries or worse when the buildings did come down. This is tantamount to war. You're looking at the lower end of Manhattan. A plane has attacked the Pentagon this morning as well. There is a report of a hijacked plane that went down near Pittsburgh. NBC's Robert Hager is tracking all of this through the FAA for us. Robert?
Well, there's some more information now on the one confirmed hijacking that we know of, and that was that American Airlines flight number 11. It was a 767, took off from Boston Logan this morning. It was to go to Los Angeles. American Airlines confirmed it was hijacked, and we have some first numbers on how many were on board. 58 passengers and a crew of 11, so 69 people on that flight. That's presumed to be one of the planes that went into one of the towers of the World Trade Center. The other planes that we know of, the other tower of the World Trade Center and the plane that went that crashed into the Pentagon area, those are unknown flights. The Pennsylvania crash, which is still not the FAA, but it's local authorities saying it, our affiliate in Pittsburgh has heard traffic on the radio scanners saying that it was a flight that originated in Chicago and was headed to Cleveland, but I'd caution that that sort of information coming off radio scanners is very, very sketchy and so very unreliable. But it's the first report off the scanners.
Bob, an FBI spokesman is quoted as saying that there were 4 flights that were hijacked altogether. We know about American 11. I'm not going to mention the names of the carriers or the numbers on the others. Are you getting any kind of detail like that at the FAA?
No, the FAA is not getting into that kind of detail, and a moment ago I said that they said there were several planes still in the air, and that was a report was coming to me while I was on the air, so I'm getting it secondhand, and now I understand what they were saying is that they had unaccounted flights, flights that were unaccounted for, so that could mean, in addition to the American Airlines Flight 11, the other planes that went into those other buildings. It does not necessarily imply that there are still planes in the air. A little more information. Canada has now shut all of its airports down, but it will leave the airports open to allow incoming planes that were bound for the U.S. and are now prohibited from landing at U.S. airports to divert into Canada. But otherwise, Canada is allowing no takeoffs, and it's not taking inbound flights from any other place other than planes that were bound for the U.S.
Well, now we get word from American Airlines, Bob, just stay with us here for a moment, that it had 2 aircraft in this tragedy. Flight 11, a Boeing 767 with 81 passengers and 9 flight attendants and 2 pilots. Flight 77, they're saying, a Boeing 757, operating from Washington, Dulles to LA with 58 passengers, 4 flight attendants, and 2 pilots. That's from Al Henkel, who's one of our guys in the Dallas area, from American Airlines.
Yes, so now we know the identity of 2 of the flights involved in today's incidents. That leaves at least 1 more, and if the report of the crash in Pittsburgh is accurate, that leaves 2 more that we don't have identified yet, but it gives us those 2 that you mentioned.
Well, it could have been both these planes could have been into the Twin Trade Towers, because it was plainly there were 2 airliners that went into the Twin Trade Towers up here, as we saw on the videotape of the crash.
Okay, they say there's a bomb in the school here. I was told by firefighters.
Pat Dawson, let's go to you in Lower Manhattan. You have a report of another bomb.
All right, Tom, we have just Tom, we've just been told we're being evacuated. You can see all the emergency workers walking north on the West Side Highway in New York. We've been told by firefighters here that there is a report of a bomb in this building. This is a school, a high school right here. And as you can see, they're moving everybody away from this building. They've said that there's a bomb in the building. They are evacuating us north now. That is according to firefighters on the scene. And we're going to move out of here right now just to keep ourselves safe. So we're going to start walking north ourselves. But that's what we're being told by New York City firefighters here, that there were reports of a bomb in that high school right there. It's called Stuyvesant High School. And so we are walking north to get out of the way. You can see just to my left here, these are even the ambulances which were down there are being moved north. The firefighters are being moved north. Everybody is being moved north. We're being asked by the police now to go north and get out of the way. Officer, do you have any idea of what the problem is?
There's a report of a secondary device possibly in the area of this school, so they're going to move everybody back as a precaution.
Secondary device meaning a bomb?
Possibly.
Okay, and where did that report come from? Was it called in?
It came in over our radios, and it's reported through our supervisors on down, so we're pulling everybody back.
And that's in the Stuyvesant High School right there?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much, Officer McQuaid.
Pat,
that's Officer McQuaid of New York City Emergency Service.
Pat, that school has been evacuated?
Yeah, well, I don't think there was anyone in the school, Katie, this morning. At this point, I think everybody had been evacuated from here probably when the first events took place early this morning, just because of the fact that it's so close to the World Trade Center. Most of these buildings around here have been evacuated, so I would imagine, I never saw any kids going into that school this morning, so I'm going to presume that they never even allowed them to get to school this morning, and that anywhere that were here at 8:45 were probably moved out almost within moments after the crash took place, because it literally is only about 10 blocks north of here, and I haven't seen any students coming in or out.
All right, Pat Dawson, thank you very much. The big story, obviously, that is still to be resolved is how many planes were hijacked. We now have a report that there could have been as many as 4 of them. We know that 2 planes were involved here at the Twin Trade Towers. There's a report of a plane down north of Pittsburgh. Another kind of plane went into the Pentagon, but there could still be planes in the air that are under the control of hijackers. We don't know for sure what flights they are or where they're headed. There are some unconfirmed reports of them. We can only tell you that American 11 and American 77 have been identified by American Airlines as 2 of the planes that were involved in the incidents today.
And the hijackings are scattered somewhat around a fairly wide area, and we just have to remember that 2 of these planes did arrive at the World Trade Center within 18 or 20 minutes of each other, just to, again, point out the coordination of this attack. We're going to go down to NBC's Tim Russert, who is standing by with more information. Tim? Tim? Apparently, Tim can't hear us.
All right, obviously, people are scrambling to get as much information. I think we do now
Tim,
have
do you
Tim's
hear us?
audio. Tim?
I can hear you now. Can you hear me?
Yeah, please give us your information.
I've been just speaking to the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, Porter Goss, and we're trying to get him on the telephone here and continue our conversation on the air. He told me that he was on the phone with House Speaker Hastert about the situation when a code red was declared on the Hill, that the Speaker has moved to a secure place because he is in the line of command of our national leadership. Congressman Porter Goss, the chairman of the Intelligence Committee, also said that this extremely well-coordinated attack could only be done by a very few people, very few organizations, and that because of the magnitude of it, it'll be relatively easy to, quote, see their fingerprints. And then we as a nation are going to have to make a very decisive retaliation as soon as we are able to identify exactly who this was. Mr. Goss said he's obviously never seen anything quite like this. As it plays out, perhaps more to come. And he will be joining us shortly on the telephone here so we all can hear his words directly. He will be briefed throughout the day because of his position. He has access to the nation's utmost secrets.
All right, Tim, obviously President Bush is on his way back to the nation's capital. Is it your understanding that he has arrived yet, or do you know his whereabouts at this point?
Katie, I do not know that, but I do know that while the White House has been evacuated, the Situation Room continues. There are people in the White House doing their jobs, and so with the Pentagon. In the nerve centers of both of those facilities, our highest-ranking officials are obviously monitoring this situation, making a determination as just how widespread this attack may be, and trying very, very hard to get a handle on exactly who did it and just how we respond.
Tim, we have secure areas, obviously, for the president in case of a nuclear attack in the past, in the mountains of Virginia, not too far from Washington, by helicopter ride. Any indication that the president may have to go to one of those facilities?
We have not yet heard that, Tom. I asked that question, and the response was, we're not going there, meaning responding to my question, not necessarily traveling there. But they obviously are on the highest state of alert. They understand the magnitude of this. They understand that the American people now are going to be waiting and watching for a response from Washington other than what the president gave in Florida. As you might expect, even our most sophisticated communications 2001 era, it is still extremely difficult trying to get any kinds of information. The cell phones are down. Many of the hard lines are down. But I've been assured by people at the White House and at the Pentagon that, in fact, they are in touch with each other and have the situation is under control the best they can. But like all of us, they simply don't know yet who did this.
Tim, you talked about Porter Goss. Obviously, the Capitol was evacuated along with other major monuments and major government buildings in Washington, D.C. Where are people, members of Congress, right now? Have they assembled anywhere, and what are they doing, and where are they?
Katie, after the explosion at the World Trade Center, Congress convened, said a prayer, and then recessed. And many of the members headed home. And they were obviously going to look forward to a very difficult week in Washington dealing with the economy. I'm told Porter Goss is on the telephone now with me. Congressman, can you hear me? Congressman Goss, can you hear me? We'll continue to effort that, Katie. But most of the congressmen have now, and congresswomen have returned to their homes here in Washington because the building itself has been evacuated. The leadership of the Congress, as I mentioned, Speaker Hassett particularly, is in a secure place, and he will be in constant communication with the President and Vice President, being the third person in the hierarchy.
All right, Tim Russert in Washington. Tim, thanks very much. And when you get Porter Goss on the phone, maybe you can give us some more information. Thanks, Tim.
We'll be right back to you.
All right, let's go now to MSNBC's Ashley Banfield, who's in Lower Manhattan, standing by with some people who were either inside those buildings or near the buildings when those planes hit. Ashley?
Yeah, hi. I am just about between 5 and 10 blocks north of the actual site of where those two towers have come down. We're obviously having a bit of trouble right now maintaining our location because we just heard one more explosion. That's about the fourth one we've heard. The police are telling us they're either car bombs or they are simply cars that have overheated so much that they're exploding. But every time one of those happens, there's a flurry of activity, and there are more emergency vehicles that come down this road. I don't know if you can shoot past me and shoot down into that black cloud in there. That is the cloud that we were in just about 45 minutes ago or so. At the time we were there, when the first trade tower came down, my producer and I were overcome by the cloud of debris and smoke that came at us so rapidly. We had to break down a window to an apartment building. We had to break the window and go into the second door inside just to breathe. We were followed by a police officer and a security guard from the World Trade Center area. I want to show you something if I can. I'm just using a cell phone so that I can hear you because there are no cell lines that are coming out of Manhattan at the time. But see if you can zero in on this right here. This is the kind of debris that we're seeing all over the ground. If you can see the address, 1 World Trade Center, Trade Center, Trade Center, Trade Center.
Okay, obviously we're having some technical problems with Ashley Banfield, who is on the ground near the World Trade Center about 5 blocks away.
All right, here's the first confirmation from United Airlines. It's confirmed one of its flights crashed in the Pittsburgh area. Flight 93, a Boeing 757. The flight involved originating in Newark. It was bound for San Francisco. No information on how many people were on board. A 757 carries a lot of folks. Anyone who's flown from Newark to San Francisco knows that most of those flights carry a full load.
Okay, so this now brings to 3 the number of confirmed flights that have been involved in this tragic day. American Airlines Flight 11 from Boston to Los Angeles. Flight 77 from Washington Dulles Airport to Los Angeles with 58 passengers on board, and now the United flight, Tom, that you just mentioned. And you can say that we have to say that the number of passengers was relatively low on those first flights, and we can only hope this was not a full flight, this United flight.
You know, there was a collapse, obviously, not just of intelligence, but of airport security as well, that many planes were hijacked almost simultaneously.
Although these days, as we know, Tom, and learned from the TWA tragedy, Flight 800, that oftentimes some of these devices are absolutely, it's impossible to see them in our kind of security X-ray machines that you have at typical airports. Some are made of plastiques. They can be very small and virtually undetectable, which is, of course, another major problem for airport security. We're going to go to Bob Bazell, who is at St. Vincent's Hospital. Obviously, we're very concerned about the people who were in the World Trade Center when these two planes crashed into them. Bob, tell me about the scene at St. Vincent's Hospital.
Katie, the wounded are starting to come in with great regularity now. Almost every 30 seconds an ambulance pulls up. Some of them are very badly burned. Some are dead. I've seen several dead bodies go in. Cardinal Egan, the head of the Catholic Archdiocese, is standing out on the street giving last rites. Said, "May God help us," many times over. There's been a call out for blood from all the New York hospitals. People are lined up around the block. People have responded in enormous numbers to that. Everybody seems to want to help in some way. New York has become kind of surrealistic on the streets above Lower Manhattan because all the subways and commuter lines and bridges and tunnels have been shut down, so many people who are not injured are wandering around aimlessly. But in the hospitals, there's so many injured coming in now that they don't have run out of gurneys, and they've brought every office chair that they have down and put sheets over that to carry people in. It's an enormous amount of work for all the staff. People have come in. Everybody who was off has been come in. Calls have gone out for specialists, for plastic surgeons, for burn specialists, and it's going to be a very grueling several days ahead.
Well, Bob, the other thing is that I don't know whether you can tell about traffic in the rest of Manhattan, because a lot of our major hospitals are well north of there. Lenox Hill, Columbia Presbyterian, New York Cornell. Are the ambulances able to get through? Have they cleared the traffic? We're in kind of a tomb here in the studios in Midtown.
Tom, I had trouble hearing you just that time. There's a system in place here where there's triaging people down in Lower Manhattan. They're putting sometimes tags around their neck to show some people you see wandering up from Lower Manhattan who have only slight injuries, who have been cleared. Others are very seriously injured. Every hospital in the area is involved in a plan to take in some kind of patients. This one where I'm at, St. Vincent's, is one of the closest with a major trauma center. But every hospital is on alert. Every hospital is just taking in what is becoming now a sea of patients.
All right, NBC's Robert Bazell. Bob, thanks very much. Let's go back to Washington and NBC's Tim Russert, who has a guest on the phone, Porter Goss, the head of the House Intelligence Committee. Tim?
Exactly right. Congressman Goss, are you there?
I'm here, Tim.
As the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, what is your official reaction to what we witnessed this morning?
Well, obviously, I'm horrified. We do our best to make sure there are no surprises like this happening to Americans at home or abroad. It's never 100% sure, and we got the wake-up call again today. It is unbelievable that anybody would do an act like this, basically using innocent victims aboard our commercial airliners as weapons against other innocent victims in our big buildings, our symbols of economy and commerce in New York, and our defense and legislative and executive buildings here in Washington.
When people are watching this at home, Congressman, they're saying to themselves, how could this happen in the United States of America? A complete breakdown in our airport security, a complete breakdown in our airspace security over the Pentagon, the center of our military command. How could something be this vulnerable?
Well, we are a free, open, democratic society, and we take great pride in that. We pay a price for it. We, as you know, if you've ever flown into Washington Reagan Airport, you fly right over the Pentagon. And many times we've commented on how vulnerable the building is for just that reason. That vulnerability was taken advantage of today. As for commercial airliners flying around New York and airspace there, obviously they fly near the trade towers. To be able to say that our airport security works 100%, anybody who flies in America knows that's not true. You answer a few questions before you get on the plane and show a photo ID. That doesn't necessarily mean you can't do mayhem on the plane, as we see from time to time. And tragically, some kind of an organization somewhere has orchestrated all this in an effective fashion. We have great intelligence capabilities out there who keep us constantly on alert about these types of reports. I can tell you, I knew of no specific reporting anything of this particular specificity on this day with these targets, but I can tell you that we are scrambling all the time to assess information that would do harm to the United States and its people. And as we know, we've seen our military installations subject to attack, our embassy subject to attack before. We stop a lot of it, but obviously we don't get it all, and we're just going to have to rethink how we do business in today's world and deal with these kinds of threats.
Based on your experience as a honored CIA agent and now as a very highly respected chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, how many organizations, terrorist organizations in the world, are capable of pulling off such a coordinated, massive attack?
I would say there's only a handful if we're not talking about state-sponsored terrorism. If you're talking state-sponsored, it could be more, but I don't think we're dealing with state-sponsored. I think we're dealing here with a loose network, a loose association of people who have the same goal, which is an anti-United States goal, who have found a way to get together and network and pull this thing off. Part of the problem with terrorism is that one of the weapons of terrorism is confusion. And one of the hopes now, of course, of the terrorists who perpetrated this is that we will have lots of confusion in the United States, and there will be rumors of other things happening, and that will upset how we go about our business and our behavior and how our law enforcement people react and so forth. That's one thing to deal with, and another thing to deal with, as the President alluded to this morning in his very strong statement, was that we will respond. The question is, against whom? And we want to make absolutely sure when we're dealing with asymmetrical warfare such as this, where we're dealing with innocent people, by and large, who are victims of this, that we respond appropriately and not provoke any other incidents that are unwarranted in the world, but get the people who actually cause this to happen. And that requires good information, and obviously we're in the process of trying to get that information.
But it may take some time to
Yes,
sort through all this, find the fingerprints, and in fact launch any kind of retaliation.
That is certainly true, and one of the hallmarks we may need is patience these days.
Congressman Porter Goss, Chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, we thank you very much. We'll be contacting you throughout the day, and we very much appreciate you joining us this morning.
Well, thank you. Add my prayers to the others.
Thank you much. Back to you, Matt.
All right, Tim, thank you very much. We're going to talk to someone here in the studio in a second, but Tom, you've got a phone number for people who are concerned about passengers on board those flights.
American Airlines has confirmed that 2 of its flights were hijacked, and for people who want to know, the number is 1-800-245-0999. United headquarters, you may not be able to get through, obviously, is 847-700-5538. United has confirmed that one of its planes went down near Pittsburgh. American has said that 2 of its planes were involved in the hijackings today, one from Dulles and one from Boston.
And apparently United Airlines was involved, is right?
Right. I said that in Pittsburgh.
Okay, right,
Yeah.
from Newark en route to San Francisco,
Right.
is that right?
Yeah.
Ron Insana is here. Oh, actually, we're going to go first to
before
Ashley
that, we're going to go
Banfield.
downtown again. Ron Insana. Oh, no, okay, we're going to... There we go. Ashley Banfield
We're
has
giving out
someone she's
emergency
talking
numbers
to.
over the airways. No, I know, but we're doing that now.
Yes, that's the only thing.
I just wanted to ask
Ashley,
you,
can you hear me?
For emergency personnel, either law enforcement or medical.
do you know anything about those extra explosions we heard?
No, I do not.
Were they car bombs?
I have no idea, ma'am.
Are you being told that we're going to have to move out of this area as well?
I was not told anything relative to that.
What about the sewers? Are they looking for bombs in sewers?
All non-essential personnel. That's all I can tell you.
Okay,
Thank you, sir.
obviously, the emergency workers are moving people out of that area. Ron Insana is here with us in the studio. Ron, obviously, you were downtown at some point because we see you have basically soot and debris in your hair and on your jacket. What happened?
Well, one of the MSNBC cameramen and I were trying to get across the street, having driven down to try to cover the event, obviously, for NBC. And as we were going across the street, we were not terribly far from the World Trade Center building, the South Tower. As we were cutting across in a quarantine zone, actually, the building began to disintegrate, and we heard it and looked up and started to see elements of the building come down, and we ran, and honestly, it was like a scene out of Independence Day. Everything began to rain down. It was pitch black around us as the winds were whipping through the corridors in lower Manhattan. I ducked around a corner, got into a car which was open, and it was nighttime for several minutes before things cleared up.
Was this the first tower that collapsed?
I believe it was the first tower that collapsed. This was the South Tower, and as it was coming down,
Our live continuous coverage continues on NBC. We're getting a look now at Sacramento International Airport. All flights across the United States have been canceled by the FAA. Sacramento International Airport, of course, included. You see a backup of people, passengers waiting to see what happens next. SAC International will be closed for at least the next 7 hours or so. There have been 3 planes in the United States hijacked, 2 American Airlines, 1 United Airlines. Now, the state of California is on high alert. Getting a look at downtown Sacramento, the state's emergency council convened. Governor Davis has requested heightened security at all state buildings. Now back to live coverage on NBC.
There were no longer people in the area except for a couple of journalists and police officers who were containing the area so people wouldn't cut through.
And once it did begin to clear after that several minutes of pitch darkness, what did you see in the streets then?
It was a very deep gray smoke. It in honesty looked like a bit of a nuclear winter, the type of thing you see in the movies with ash all over the ground, on top of cars, on police cars, on windows. I made my way into a building because of the one light I could see, and stayed there until a couple of police officers and a few of the people inside the building were able to get into a vehicle. We picked up a few injured people along the way and dropped them off at the hospital.
You did? What were their injuries?
Well, one policeman had a deep gash in his forehead. He was all right. He was clearly a bit shocked, and the young lady had shrapnel in her arm. Don't know what it was, whether it was part of a building or glass from another building.
Was there a lot of peripheral damage to other buildings and stores
really
in the area? Because when that building came down, one would only imagine all the pieces of steel and concrete that came cascading down as well and hit other places.
I imagine the collateral damage was enormous, but we were probably, I'd say, 2 or 3 blocks away in a building where we holed up for a time until we were fairly comfortable that it was safe to come out. It was truly the most intense and frightening experience I've ever had in my life. It was literally pitch black on the streets, and people were, obviously inhaling a great deal of this material as well, so there are many folks who are having difficulty breathing and were wearing facial masks as well.
We're happy you're all right.
We have United Airlines confirms that United Flight 175 from Boston to Los Angeles is down as well. No details yet. It's confirmed that Flight 93, we believe from Newark to San Francisco, is down. No details yet. That's the one that we think went down in the Pittsburgh area. I wish that we could be more specific. The information is, as you might expect, pretty chaotic, but there have been at least 4 airliners that have been hijacked today.
And Tom, there's going to be an awful lot of scrutiny on the security in Boston at Logan Airport because it now appears that 2 of these flights originated there. And somehow someone managed to get on these planes and hijack them.
Well, this is an event, Ron, we're happy to see you. And
thank you. You have no idea how happy I am to be here.
Yeah, it is a relief, but then you think about the experiences of thousands of other people who are down there in the epicenter of all that, and were there when it occurred. Our hearts go out to them. We don't know what the numbers are yet.
And you hear about Cardinal Egan delivering last rites outside of St. Vincent's Hospital.
And the magnitude of this will go on for some time. This is not just a national tragedy, but this is a national security event of an untold magnitude that this country is going to have to deal with. The president's coming back, and we are at war, in effect, here. This country has suffered a devastating attack that will cost us in loss of life. It will also cost us in terms of our psychological security that we have in this country. We're going to have to revisit a lot of our freedoms as a result of this kind of an attack. And then, of course, there's the whole question of retaliation.
This is an
Who is responsible and what do we do?
Tom, this is an upsetting wire that just came across the transom from the West Bank. It says thousands of Palestinians celebrated Tuesday's terror attacks in the United States, chanting God is great and distributing candy to passers-by, even as their leader, Yasser Arafat, said he was horrified. The U.S. government has become increasingly unpopular in the West Bank and Gaza Strip in the past year of Israeli-Palestinian fighting, with many Palestinians accusing Washington of siding with Israel.
For those of you who think that events in far-off places like the Middle East or in Afghanistan or in the subcontinent or in places in Asia have no effect on us, this is the answer today. This place remains an enormous target in the eyes of a lot of people, and we are so vulnerable because of all those things that make us so great, our freedoms and our sense of security that we have. But America has been changed today by all of this.
We want to go and find out more about what's being done for those who were injured in these attacks. Leslie Van Sant is with the American Red Cross. I believe she's joining us from Washington. Ms. Van Sant, can you hear me?
Yes, I can, Matt.
Tell me what kind of resources you have available to you to pour into these areas where, obviously, in Lower Manhattan and in Washington, D.C. and outside Pittsburgh.
Well, our chapters on the area are local disaster volunteers. They are, of course, the first people on the scene and responding. Unfortunately, probably now some of them are also victimized by the event. We're also mobilizing 80,000 units of blood to transfer to the regions as needed, and, taking guidance from emergency management personnel on what assistance we can provide to them to make this response go smoothly.
Is there anything that, I mean, I know it's early after this has happened, but is there anything you can think of that people might be able to help you out with in terms of donating certain things? You mentioned blood and those things.
Well, we're asking people who are in other parts of the country who are blood donors or maybe not blood donors, maybe they could call and schedule an appointment so we can make sure that the supply stays ready. Our disaster volunteers, our mental health volunteers and health volunteers are going to be responding. This will, as Tom mentioned earlier, this is going to be a long, long response. The emotional trauma, the emotional impact is going to be felt weeks, months into the future, even years. So we're going to be working very hard at this for a long time.
All right, Leslie Van Sant with the American Red Cross. Ms. Van Sant, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Let's go now to Kathleen Zici of New York University Hospital.
The building shake, the windows rattle, and looking outside immediately saw people on the run. There was pandemonium in the hallways. Now that section of the Pentagon, I thought at first when it was described to me that it may have hit in an area where some of the special operations offices are located. The Assistant Secretary for Special Operations is located near there, but the plane actually hit maybe about 60 to 70 feet to the right of that location. In that part of the building, there's it's very near a mall area, actually, where they have a shopping area for Pentagon employees. After all, there are 25 to 30,000 employees in there on any given day. And also in that part of the building, you had many Navy personnel, many reserve personnel. I bumped into many Army personnel who are adjacent to that. They think everybody's all right. The Navy people I talked to said they still had a few people that were unaccounted for. But again, it's going to be impossible to tell exactly what the casualty count is in there until they get that fire under control.
Matt.
All right, Jim Michalczewski outside the Pentagon, thanks very much. Joining us now is General Norman Schwarzkopf, who was the commander of all forces in the Persian Gulf War. General Schwarzkopf, good morning to you.
Good morning.
Obviously, you've seen the footage, I'm sure, of the Pentagon and of southern Manhattan. We haven't seen much footage outside Pittsburgh. What are your thoughts this morning?
Well, it's a very, very sad day for this country. It's really a sad day for the world as far as I'm concerned, and your heart goes out to all those families and your prayers go out to all those people who lost their lives.
We are fighting a war now, it seems, a terrorist war here in this country. The question is, how do we go about fighting it, General?
Well, that's one of those easy questions to ask and one of those very tough questions to answer. The deterrence against terrorists is almost impossible because these are people who could care less about their own survival. And normally deterrence is just says, you hit me and we hit you back harder. And in this case, these people don't care whether they lose their lives or not, and therefore it makes it doubly tough to deter. The fact is that the world is getting smaller, and terrorism has come to our shores because we have the ability to span oceans and great distances in a very short time.
General, have you been able to talk to anyone at the Pentagon and get some updates on who may have been injured or lost?
No, I mean, the information that I've heard is basically what you all have, and that's it. They didn't hit the very critical parts, and therefore maybe we don't have as many casualties there. But when you look at what happened at the World Trade Center and the number of casualties that they probably have there, it's just horrendous.
General Schwarzkopf, hi, it's Katie. I'm just wondering, I mean, obviously you've been in the military for a long, long time. Have you ever heard, or is this a method of destruction that the U.S. military was aware of and had concerns about, where they would actually, hijackers would use a plane as a flying bomb?
Well, Katie, Tom Clancy wrote a book about just that. Several years ago, he wrote a book about a Japanese pilot crashing his 747 directly into the Capitol building and wiping out the national government. And so it's not something that's new. Obviously, what's kind of shocking is we thought we had good protection against hijacking of aircraft, and what's very apparent today is that something needs to be done about that if this many aircraft can be hijacked
Meaning security
Also,
at airports across the country, General?
That and many other measures that could be taken, but I mean, it's kind of frightening when you consider the number of aircraft that were simultaneously hijacked and apparently with, I don't know, I can't say with apparent ease, I don't know, but it did in fact happen, and that's kind of frightening in itself.
Well, also, General Tom Brokaw here, the failure of intelligence here. I know it's always easy to say that at this point, but this is a very sophisticated and obviously widespread, complex operation that was planned. It was very tightly held in the most sophisticated way.
Yeah, Tom, but you and I both know that getting inside the intelligence, getting inside a terrorist group is probably the most difficult type of penetration that you can do. I mean, you've got to have somebody on the inside that can let you know what's going on, and that's not always the easiest thing to do in this type of terrorist organization.
All right, thank you very much, General Norman Schwarzkopf. We'll be back in touch with you throughout the day as we get more information. We'd love to get your oversight on all of this if we can.
Okay.
Well, let's go to Paul Bremer now, Ambassador Paul Bremer, who's the chairman of the National Commission on Terrorism. Mr. Ambassador, do we have any idea whatsoever who may be responsible for this?
Well, as you were just saying, we have a massive intelligence failure and a huge security failure that's going to have to be looked into. Analytically, there probably are 4 possible candidates. There's the Osama bin Laden al-Qaeda group that you've been talking about. There is the possibility of a Middle Eastern group such as Hezbollah or the Palestinian Islamic Jihad conducting an attack like this. And there are at least 2 states which at least are capable of such an attack, and that would be Iran and Iraq. So you have probably not more than 4 suspects.
How do we begin to find out who is responsible?
Well, the good news is that the hijacking 4 airplanes is a very complicated operation. Even hijacking 1 is complicated. And they will have left some trail behind them. They will have had to have checked in, they will have had to have purchased tickets either under their name or alias names. They will have had to have showed pieces of identity. There will be a trail that will lead back from the hijackers at some point to the perpetrators. It may take some time, but we'll get there.
You're an expert on national security matters, Ambassador. How is this country going to have to change?
Well, I think it's one of those great challenges of fighting terrorism is to find the balance between being tempted to overreact, but also being absolutely certain, as the President said this morning, that people understand we're not going to take this sitting down. And I think once the perpetrators have been identified, and I believe they will be, the United States will have to retaliate with the full force of its military as hard as it possibly can. This is an act of war. It's an act of war that some have described as a domestic Pearl Harbor. In many ways, it's worse than Pearl Harbor. I think we will probably find the casualties are going to be higher than they were at Pearl Harbor. In Pearl Harbor, we knew immediately who had done it, and we therefore knew what the return address was. It was Japan. Here, we have higher casualties, less certainty as to where the attack came from, and therefore a more difficult response. But there must be a very strong military response to this act of war.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Paul Bremer, who is a longtime colleague of Henry Kissinger and a veteran of national security affairs in this country. This is routine in times like this. The Taliban ambassador to Pakistan has condemned what he called the terrorist attack, saying this is a terrorist act. We strongly condemn as the Taliban have given shelter to the Saudi militant Osama bin Laden, of course, and he's been accused by the United States in the past of masterminding these kinds of attacks. So they're at least on the record from a rhetorical point of view of saying we had nothing to do with this.
Let's go to Martin Fletcher, NBC's Martin Fletcher, Tom, who is in Israel right now. Martin, tell me the reaction by the Israelis to this turn of events here in the United States.
Well, of course, everybody has been very, very quick to express complete solidarity with the United States. The Israelis, of course, very experienced in these kind of things. They've offered to send all their emergency help they can to the United States. They've also, by the way, just closed the Israeli airspace just in case things do spread. But among the Palestinians, there's a different reaction. Yasser Arafat immediately expressed complete horror, condemned the attacks completely, but on the same time, in some places on the streets in the Palestinian towns, there's been rather strong expressions of support, of delight even. There were 3,000 Palestinians took to the streets, we're told, in the West Bank city of Nablus, and smaller demonstrations also in East Jerusalem, Tulkarm, Bethlehem, other Palestinian towns in support of the bombers. Happy of these few Palestinians at what has happened. But of course, that's just, we don't know how widespread that is, but there have been some clear support, demonstrations of support for the bombings.
But Martin, we should point out...
I must stress, the Palestinian leader, I should stress that Palestinian leaders all condemn totally the bombings.
We should put into some perspective for us, if you could, Martin, how displeased many Palestinians are with the United States right now about their feelings that somehow the U.S. is siding more with Israeli and with the Israelis in terms of what's going on in the Middle East.
Well, there's complete support across the board, belief among Palestinians that the United States and Israel are one. That the United States is together with Israel in the situation here in Israel and the West Bank. They believe the United States completely supports Israel and therefore deserves to some kind of attacks against the United States. So there have been many calls here, especially in recent weeks, by the way, in some of the Palestinian media, for attacks against the United States. So there is a great feeling of anger, a great belief that America supports Israel, and a great belief also that Israel, without American support, could not be as aggressive in its retaliation against Palestinian suicide attacks as it is. So
but Martin, that's really
a feeling, strong feeling.
I was just going to say, Martin, that sentiment.
Sorry, Katie,
I was just going to say that sentiment is really nothing new. Has it been exacerbated? in recent weeks in terms of how the Bush administration has been dealing with the Mideast?
I think it has been exacerbated because throughout the last 11 months of the fighting, there was always a feeling among Palestinian leaders that the worse the fighting got, the more likely it would be that the United States administration would intervene, would try to help impose a solution on the Palestinians and the Israelis. The Palestinians have always wanted an international force to get involved, believing that's the only way to really get to a solution, an imposed solution. And what they're seeing from Washington is, if anything, President Bush backtracking from that, making it rather clear in several statements from American leaders that Israel and the Palestinians should get on with it, and that until there's a real possibility of peace talks, America won't get involved. That's the belief of Palestinians. But of course, I just want to stress that this Palestinian anger, we don't know that has anything to do, of course, with what happened today.
All right. Thank you, Martin Fletcher, in Israel this morning, this afternoon.
I was going to say we have a couple of other developments that we ought to share with everyone. Ripple effect seems like an understatement. The U.S. borders with Mexico and Canada now have been closed. White House sources are saying all principals in the White House, senior Bush advisors and officials like the Vice President and the President himself are either in the Situation Room or in bomb shelters. They will not say exactly where the President is, except to say that he is safe. There have been comparisons to Pearl Harbor this morning. 2,400 people were killed in Pearl Harbor on that attack on December 7th, 1941. It is likely that the death toll today will be higher. The political magnitude of this is yet to be fully calibrated as well. But as we have been saying throughout the day, this is a new form of warfare against the United States.
And as Ambassador Bremer said, in that case, we had the return address.
Right.
It's still certainly unclear and may remain unclear who was responsible for these absolutely horrendous attacks.
Christian Martin is a producer for Dateline NBC, and he joins us now. Christian, you were obviously down in the area based on your appearance, and I understand you shot some video while you were down there. First of all, tell me how close to the buildings you were.
I was probably about 2 to 3 blocks away, and they were moving most of the folks back. Near me were probably 20 or 30 cops and emergency personnel, and at this point we were thinking, wow, and then suddenly this cloud started moving real fast, as you can see, and it was a dead sprint for about 20 of us. I around the corner, the cloud blew me into a car across the street. I crawled under a car. You could hear, it was pitch black, you could hear chunks of concrete falling all around you.
You were under a car?
I got blown into a car and then crawled under a car.
How difficult was it to breathe at that point?
Very difficult. It was probably pitch black for about 2 minutes. I was covering my mouth. It was, for a while you didn't hear anything, and then you heard a lot of moans and groans. It was really just a canyon, and the entire force of the blast came shooting down it much faster than you would imagine. As you watched it fall, you thought.
You say you heard moans and groans. Did you see many of the injured around you as when the dust finally settled somewhat, so that you could get out from under the car?
I was really kind of in shock and stumbled around for a little bit. You could see that there were some people there. Everybody that was in the area was pretty affected. There was no emergency personnel helping anybody. Everybody that was there was in pretty bad shape at the moment. And as I started to wander farther and farther away from it, you could see more people coming. The cops and the firemen down there were just incredible, and probably still are down there. So.
Obviously, it was a very frightening situation for you to be in. Did you have any idea? I mean, were they anticipating that because of the size of the hole in this building, that the whole building might come crashing down?
That wasn't my sense. I mean, it was obviously a terrible tragedy, but I felt that I was down in Oklahoma City about 3 hours after that blast happened, and I felt that things were beginning to ramp down. The emergency, obviously there was a lot of tragedy going on, but I felt like the cops and the firemen were sort of beginning to get the situation under control. They were moving everybody back. By and large, the streets were cleared. There was a lot of emergency tape, and then when that started, we were all surprised. You can hear the voices saying, "Move back." I mean, there were a lot of people on the street.
Did you see the triage units at work and people being helped in the immediate vicinity? Because one of our first concerns when this happened was, what about the people who were outside the building who were in serious pain?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what was going on right in the immediate area. I assume there were, I hope there was no one around. As I said, I sort of stumbled away from it, and by the time I got 3 or 4 blocks away and the air cleared enough so that you could see, we were then all being pushed away, but I mean, you could still see the remains of the plane crash from earlier that day. I mean, I shot some video of a huge airplane wheel. There were body parts, you know, all over West Street. I mean, it was insane down there.
Well, Christian, thanks so much for coming by. We're glad you're safe, of course, as well. Meanwhile, we're going to go back to Washington, where Bob Hager is standing by with more information. Bob.
Katie, the word now on these air crashes is there's 266 dead total. That's the rough addition at the moment in the hijacking of 4 planes. 2 of them were United airliners and 2 American airliners. 2 out of the 4, by the way, I'm getting my own voice coming back to me in my ear if somebody can help me on that. 2 of them were American, 2 United airliners. 2 of the 4 took off from Boston, 1 from Newark, 1 from Washington, Dulles. 2 of those planes went into the World Trade Center, 1 went into the Pentagon, and 1 crashed in rural Pennsylvania. There are 50 flights that are still in the air at this point. That is 50 commercial flights. The FAA has put what they call a ground hold on all flights in the U.S. So 50 of those flights are still in the air. That means that virtually everybody's landed at this point, and if there's any good news in any of this, they say that at the moment none of those planes appear to be hijacked or in trouble. And they're all very close to landing now, within 40 or 50 miles of an airport, their airport where they intend to land. So that should put them on the ground in the next half hour or so.
Bob, I just want to ask you, Bob, have many of those planes been diverted? In other words, are they reaching their destinations, or are they having emergency or premature landings elsewhere?
Yeah, there is nothing on that. They left it to the discretion of the pilots. They said if you want to go on to your landing, unless you're going to land in New York or Washington, go ahead to your landing if you want to, or you can divert if you choose to do that. So New York and Washington were the only 2 that were closed to incoming flights. I'm now told that there are 22 international flights still in the air. So we have 50 domestic commercial flights still in the air, 22 international flights still in the air. None of those believed to be in trouble, so that it's been more than 2 hours now since the last of these crashes, and hopefully if that word is correct from the FAA, then we've seen the last of this.
Bob,
Again,
I was just going to mention, you know, Peter Greenberg, our travel editor, had an interesting observation that perhaps the airlines that or planes that were chosen were because they had the most fuel. They were planning to travel across country most of those flights. Can you weigh in on that?
It is curious that 3 out of these 4 flights were bound for Los Angeles. They were 757s and 767s.
And the other to San Francisco.
Yeah, but none of them had to fly long distances because the 2 crashes in New York, let's see, those planes came from Boston, and from the second tower crash was, both of those flights were from Boston, the 2 crashes into the World Trade Center towers, and then the crash here in Washington into the Pentagon was a takeoff from Washington Dulles, so that's very close by, and the crash that happened in rural Pennsylvania was a takeoff from Newark Airport, so that was not a terribly long distance.
So I think what Katie's getting to, Bob, is that the planes were loaded with a lot of fuel because they were anticipating a long flight, and perhaps they were chosen because of the damage that fuel would do on impact.
Well, that could be a factor, yes, because you would imagine that a plane with a whole lot of fuel would make a lot bigger explosion than one that was had only a limited amount of fuel left.
All right, Bob Hager in Washington. Bob, thank you very much. So now we know from Bob that there are 266 people dead as a result of those 4 planes. Obviously, this is an unspeakable tragedy for so many families throughout the country, not to mention all the lives lost here in New York City and at the Pentagon. But again, American Airlines Flight 11, American Airlines Flight 77, United Airlines Flight 175, and United Airlines Flight 93. Both American Airlines flights, I understand, were en route from Boston to Los Angeles. The United Airlines Flight 1 from Newark to San Francisco, and the second from Washington, D.C., actually from Dulles International Airport in Virginia to Los Angeles as well. If you need any information about a loved one on board, these are the following numbers you should call: 1-800-245-0999 or 1-800-932 8555. Those numbers, the first one for American Airlines, the second one for United.
And of course, what we don't know about those flights is what happened in the cockpit. That had to be the worst kind of terror, because they were able to force the plane, two of the planes into the World Trade Center and then one into the Pentagon. Did they take over controls? Did they shoot the pilot and the co-pilot? Did they have a gun at their head and force them to do this? We don't know, and we don't know whether there's any radio traffic to describe what may have been going on at that time. There's just been one report that they knew there was a hijacking, and they were citing radio traffic at that time. So this only adds to the horror that I think everyone is beginning to feel across this country today. Clearly. About what they try to imagine what has been going on. And it is just beginning, I suspect, for a lot of people to fully sink in about what we're going through. And we are just halfway through this day. And it's going to be a long day and a long week and many months to come as we continue to deal with this. So there's going to be a test of this country, and we're going to have to steel ourselves for some very difficult decisions
Clearly,
ahead.
this was a suicide mission of enormous magnitude, and of course we heard speculation from Pat Dawson at the scene that there might have even been a secondary bomb on board the aircraft, although who knows what kind of explosion would occur if a plane actually crashes in a building that's 110 stories high.
Is it too much to ask? Do we still have that identified? We're not going to do this in a gratuitous way, but to give you an idea of what happened, we have an astonishing piece of videotape of the second plane going into the World Trade Center, and you can see it coming from right to left across the screen. We'll try to play that for you in slow motion. There it is, first real time. And now let's just back it up for a moment, and we'll play it in slow-mo so that you can see that, in fact, it was an airliner.
And when you saw the impact from a different angle, you saw the plane hit one side of the building, and then you saw parts of the other side of the building blowing out. So you can only imagine how far that plane traveled through the building on impact. And keeping in mind that we want to talk about the location here. Southern tip of Manhattan, Newark Airport, probably what, Tom, as the crow flies, 10 miles?
Yeah, maybe.
To the west and south. Kennedy Airport, another 10 miles maybe to the east. LaGuardia Airport, just to the east as well and slightly north. So air traffic, obviously it's a congested area, although that was restricted airspace. No planes fly that close to New York City.
Landing gear at the bottom is somewhere in lower Manhattan. It was December 7th, 1941, actually the next day, that FDR said this is a day that shall live in infamy. We are living through another day of infamy for this country.
That was some videotape that was taken by our producer, our Dateline producer, Christian Martin, who was at the scene, Tom, right before that tower collapsed. I'm not sure if he was there before the first tower collapsed or the second tower. I believe it was the first tower. And as we saw, as you mentioned, airline debris, and apparently Christian saw some very grisly things on the scene.
Well, it turns out that President Bush has been diverted to Barksdale Air Force Base, which we believe is in Louisiana, and we expect to hear from him shortly. He has been taken to a secure area. There were reports that he would be taken back to Washington, to Andrews Air Force Base. We've been talking about the secure facilities that are available there to him in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia. Actually, the briefing room in the White House itself is secure, but they've decided to divert him, obviously, to an Air Force base, and he will be addressing the nation shortly. You have in your nation's capital now F-16s flying CAPs, they're called. These are air cover missions over the nation's capital after the plane went into the Pentagon today. So we have never been witness to anything quite like this in the United States within the continental borders of this country. An active war, nothing less than that. There is your nation's capital. It is effectively evacuated from the Capitol building itself down majestic Pennsylvania Avenue to the White House. A crisis of grave proportions on this land, and the President of the United States in his first year in office will be addressing the nation, we're told, before too long.
And we would have to assume this would have been true, but a Navy public affairs spokesman now tells WUSA TV that there are indeed dead inside the Pentagon. We want to go back to lower Manhattan. NBC's Pat Dawson is standing by there with more. Pat?
Matt, hundreds of people, we assume, hundreds of people based on the information that we've gotten from emergency officials here are still in there, obviously. We don't know their condition. We have not seen anybody coming out in some time. The question really for rescue officials at this point is when they can begin to move large numbers of emergency service units, either firefighters, police, or of any kind, into that area down there. This area you're looking at here, we are probably about 12 blocks north of where the World Trade Center once stood. This area here has been secured off basically for emergency workers and also for the press. If you just beyond those police barricades, about 50 yards beyond me, is as far as we are allowed to go. And then beyond that, as you can see, literally hundreds of firefighters and other emergency workers who are massed down there. They have bulldozers, they have all sorts of ambulances and the like. But we have not seen more than a handful of ambulances coming out of there in the last hour or so. That may be only that they are not using this particular way out. That is, of course, possible. They may be routing them from other directions. We can't say that. But at least from this direction, we have seen only a handful of ambulances coming out of there. And clearly, there have to be a great many people in there who are either injured or dead at this point. We spoke to a Port Authority police officer, a lieutenant who was in the building at the time just a few minutes ago. The Port Authority, we remind you once again, is the agency that runs those two twin towers, as well as the World Trade Center complex and the airports and the tunnels and bridges around New York City. He said that he had been in the building at the time, that he heard the explosions. He said it was a frightening situation, and at one point after the initial crash of those two airliners into the sides of the buildings, when there were fires blazing, he said that he saw at least a couple of people leaping from high floors, obviously because of the fires presumably behind them. Anyone leaping from a height of that, he said probably at least the 30th floor, obviously leaping to their death. There will be a number of horrible stories. We have already heard many of them so far, but at this point we have basically what we have is hundreds of emergency rescue people who are massed here, and we are waiting to hear when they will be able to go in significant numbers. That's the key thing. A handful may go in here and there, but obviously there are most likely large numbers of people who need help, and we are waiting to hear when large numbers of rescue workers will be able to go in. Back to the studio.
All right, Pat Dawson here in Manhattan. Pat, thank you very much. A bulletin has just crossed that says President Bush says U.S. military on high alert at home and abroad. Again, we believe he is being diverted to Louisiana, and we are waiting to hear word from him. He will reportedly address the nation sometime in the next few hours.
I want to go back to Lower Manhattan. Ann Thompson is standing by with more on the story. Ann?
Hi, Matt. Hi, Katie. I was down trying to get to the World Trade Center about 10 o'clock this morning, and I was walking on Broadway at Fullerton, and suddenly we heard an explosion. It was the first tower coming down, and down Broadway you could just see this wall of debris come flying at us, and I was by myself. I took cover in between a column and the building at 195 Broadway, and we stood there I crouched there probably for about a good 5 minutes. It took that long for all the debris to come by, for the air to clear. When I got up, I was covered head to toe with debris. They opened the building. The gates in that building had been locked. They opened the doors. We went inside. They had evacuated this building, which is some 28 floors of commercial space, right after the first plane went into the World Trade Center. We stood in there. You could see outside. It looked like a war zone. Debris, dust, ankle deep, cars on fire, cars turned askew in the explosion. We decided to stay inside. I was there with some firemen and some maintenance workers of this building. We decided to stay in there because it appeared to be safer inside. Then at about 10:30, it looked like everything was all clear. I started to walk out. I walked down Broadway towards Canal, and we heard a second explosion. I ran back into the building. All the chandeliers shook. Again, we were covered with black debris from everywhere. At that point, a fireman came into the building and said we all had to stay in one place. He then told us all to get out of the building because they felt if there was a third explosion that this building would be in danger. And then I walked down Broadway to to Canal Street, and it was like walking through something that looked like out of a movie set of a nuclear holocaust. It was nothing but debris and papers and all parts of buildings down and glass.
Can we please move?
I will,
please.
sir. I will.
Right now, please.
Tell the people, please move back.
All right, obviously, Ann Thompson. Ann, thank you very much for that report. Ann's being asked to move her location. Obviously, firefighters and police officers are frantically trying to help those people who have been hurt, who perhaps have not been rescued, or perhaps to retrieve even bodies as a result of this.
So many people in this country obviously in a state of shock over what's happened in several locations, but at times like this you do find people who try to rally to do what they can at St. Vincent's Hospital, which is just south of the World Trade Center, where they've taken a lot of the wounded, 184 patients in total, 10 critical. There are lines now of people who are showing up to donate blood, which is something
heartening in the face of this tragedy. Catherine Hughes is at Virginia Hospital Center, where many of the people who were hurt at the Pentagon, where yet another plane crashed early this morning, is here to tell us what the situation is. Is this the old Arlington Hospital, Catherine?
Yes, it is, Katie.
Can you tell us about the people you're seeing there?
We now have approximately 26 patients. We are expecting more. They're coming in at the moment. We have called in additional surgeons, nurses, and other staff members to help with this crisis. And we've seen basically a variety of medical issues coming in. We do have some in surgery at this time.
So tell me about the medical issues that these individuals are experiencing, Catherine, if you could.
As I said, there are a variety of medical issues, some severe and some not. We do have some cuts, burns, people coming in with shortness of breath. We took our first person at about 10:35 this morning, and they are coming from the Pentagon area.
Catherine, if you could give us an idea, is this the only area hospital that is treating people who are inside the Pentagon at the time of the crash, or have they been diverted to other hospitals as well?
I don't know that. I know that we have already seen 26, and we currently are receiving patients at this time.
A Navy Public Affairs spokesperson has confirmed, or apparently told a local station in Washington, that people have lost their lives inside the Pentagon. And you expect how many more patients, Catherine?
We're expecting patients. We don't know how many. We are just taking them.
All right.
This time.
All right. Catherine Hughes at Virginia Hospital Center, formerly known as Arlington Hospital. Catherine, thanks so much for talking with us. We appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Just to recap where the president was when this occurred, just before 9 o'clock this morning, he was taking part in an education event near Longboat Key, Florida. He was actually, we understand, reading to students down there when he first got word of the first plane crashing into the World Trade Center, and then he was given word that a second plane had crashed into the other tower. He did have a chance to make some comments before heading out of Florida, and here's a sample of what he had to say.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is a difficult moment for America. I unfortunately will be going back to Washington after my remarks. Secretary Rod Pace and Lieutenant Governor will take the podium and discuss education. I do want to thank the folks here at Booker Elementary School for their hospitality. Today we've had a national tragedy. Two airplanes have crashed into the World Trade Center in an apparent terrorist attack on our country. I have spoken to the Vice President, to the Governor of New York, to the Director of the FBI, and I've ordered that the full resources of the federal government go to help the victims and their families, and to conduct a full-scale investigation to hunt down and to find those folks who committed this act. Terrorism against our nation will not stand. And now, if you join me in a moment of silence.
I want to mention that President Bush is said to have made a couple of other comments. He said that freedom itself was attacked. Freedom will be protected. and that the U.S. will hunt down and punish those responsible. Go ahead.
He also said that the U.S. military was on high alert at home and abroad.
Just to update you on the situation, we told you that there had been several international flights en route to the United States. The original plan from the FAA was to divert those to Canada. We now understand that they will be allowed to land in the U.S. The FAA is not saying why they're not going forward with their original plans to divert to Canada, and we don't have any information on the points of origin or the destinations of those 22 planes. NBC's Campbell Brown is standing by in Washington. Campbell?
Well, Matt, what we can tell you is that we do know the president now is at the Barksdale Air Force Base. That's in Shreveport, Louisiana, northern Louisiana. He flew there from Florida, where he was this morning, and it was interesting because in those early minutes, shortly after Air Force One took off from Florida, no one was told within the White House press corps where the president was, where he was going. Our information now is coming from what we call the travel pool. It is one network reporter who is on board the plane with the president. He did make a brief statement. We're waiting to get more on what he said when they landed at Barksdale Air Force Base. We're not sure whether or not he's going to stay there or that they will take the president somewhere else. There are a number of options, obviously. There's a bunker in Colorado Springs that the military runs. There is the so-called doomsday plane, which is another option. This is an aircraft that is far more sophisticated than Air Force One. It has the most advanced electronic equipment on board where the president could communicate with anyone from that plane. It can stay in the air. It can be refueled in the air. So it is something that was designed and built in the event that there was a nuclear attack, but it is a possible option today if they feel like they need that. Of course, the president, when he was in Florida and initially made those remarks you played a moment ago, he did say he was coming back from Washington, but obviously now they're reevaluating the situation to try to figure out where it may be best for him to operate from. There are a few officials still at the White House now. His National Security Advisor, Condoleezza Rice, and other key officials are in the White House. We're told they're operating out of the Situation Room, and that a few areas of the White House have been designated as so-called hard rooms, meaning Special Secret Service agents are there guarding the few key people who are needed to stay at the White House. The rest of the White House has been evacuated. But the president is obviously in close contact with his national security team, who is remaining there for the time being. He was informed of this.
We have criticized all forms of criticism as Afghanistan has itself faced and has become the victim of
Switching to CNN, a live press conference underway, a Taliban news conference live on CNN.
Terrorism is a terrifying and hateful hatred or hateful method. And this incident is, from the humanitarian point of view, surely a very vast and very terrifying incident. Any questions? Any questions?
Have you received any kind of information, any kind of communication from the United States or any other organization?
The American Mutahida Ayalati or the Balasan Radi Kabishtar Service?
No, Cross Puricha from the Canada Cadet, or was the Tunu Mohem Habarachi, a week for Rana Manyakaji. Today, she was a week the select Raman Filibi, Udachi Islami Marat for the Chatamas Norita for the
no contact up to now. They might be busy, or they are busy in the rescue operation. So they need condolence, but up to now, no communication from them.
Does the Taliban categorically condemn these attacks on the United States?
Taliban to Marhalawara from the Taliban to the Hamid
موږ د توریزم ټول انواع همیشه غندلې د پخوا څخه په دې باره کې پالیسي ښکاره.
Our policy was very clear from the very beginning, and we have criticized, and even now we criticize terrorism in all its forms.
Can you rule out any involvement by Osama bin Laden?
Osama bin Laden لاستو هیچ قسم د یا هر یو قسم د لاستو لودنه تشکیل راغلی.
تروس پورې چې هغه باندې رسمي تور هم نه دی لګولې.
No, up till now, no one has blamed or accused him formally.
The Taliban have said that they will maintain Mr. bin Laden without communication, unable to communicate. Can you be convinced at this time that your policy of keeping him without communication has been effective in recent months?
طالبان ژمنه کړې چې اسامه بن لادن سره د هر قسم اتصالاتي امکانات بدون لري چې تاسو دا خبره تاییدوي چې اوس هم هغه پالیسي کې باندې عملي ده.
موږ په پالیسي کې تغیر نه ورغلی دی.
No change in our policy in this regard.
Do you think the policy is working, Mr. Mutwakiel?
او دا پالیسي کار هم کوي. مسئله کړی ده چې د خبره نه
Suspicions obviously turn to Osama bin Laden. In the media, he's been mentioned as possibly having a hand in this. Are you concerned that Afghanistan could be on the receiving end of recriminations of reprisals, of responding back?
توجه یا ګمان ته راوړي مطبوعاتو یا میډیا د دنیا هم اخیسته ده آیا تاسو ورته کوئ چې افغانستان د دې اسلام الدین یا د اسلام الهدف وګوري.
زه فکر کوم چې دا غنوم اخته هم یوازې به د فقط څخه په هغه تفسیرو کې ډېر نوم راځي خلا مخسوي.
I think that even if someone has taken his name in the media, might be just because his name was repeatedly mentioned in the past in the comments. Just for this reason, his name might have been repeated.
Just the second half of the question, though, are you concerned that Afghanistan could receive reprised attacks?
We don't see or foresee any difficulty in this regard because there is no argument or no reason for it.
If it were to happen, if there were to be attacks, what would the implications be of such a situation?
If there were attacks from,
as Jonathan said, if there were to be reprisals.
That is Wakil Mutawakel of the Taliban, which is described as a religious militia based in Afghanistan. Osama bin Laden, obviously suspect number one in the bombings in the U.S. today. He is a Saudi dissident who has been given asylum in Afghanistan. And the Taliban saying they are condemning the attacks, but they're also adding that they don't believe that Osama bin Laden has the facilities needed to carry out the attacks that we've seen in the United States today. Back now to more coverage.
There's also been concerns expressed.
Then there was American Airlines flight number 77 from Dulles, Washington Dulles to Los Angeles, and finally United flight 93, the plane you just referred to that crashed outside of Pittsburgh, about 80 miles southeast of Pittsburgh. It was from Newark en route to San Francisco.
Here are the phone numbers if you'd like to inquire. If you think you had a family member or a loved one on board any of those planes, American Airlines has set up a number at 1-800-245-0999 and United Airlines 1-800-932-8555.
You mentioned that we have not shown shots of Pittsburgh and the United Airlines plane that crashed in Somerset County, Pennsylvania. We have the first shots, pretty shaky video of that airplane that crashed shortly after the two planes crashed into the World Trade Tower. At least we got the information. And after that other plane crashed into the Pentagon.
In short, and you really can't put this story into short form, this has been perhaps the most devastating day in American history in terms of terrorism. It certainly has been. 4 separate attacks, obviously coordinated fairly thoroughly. 2 on the World Trade Center here in New York, 1 on the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. A 4th, the hijacking and crash of a plane, as you just saw, outside Pittsburgh. Unclear now as to how many lives have been lost, but the numbers are bound to be staggering as the day progresses.
Aboard those airplanes alone, 266 people have lost their lives. That was confirmed by both United and American Airlines, and we are unclear, as Matt just said, about the perhaps thousands of people who have been killed and certainly injured as a result of what happened in New York City and outside Washington, D.C. at the Pentagon. With more, here's Tom.
This is an NBC News special report. Here is Tom Brokaw.
September 11th, the year 2001, a day unlike any other in the long course of American history, a terrorist act of war against this country. President Bush saying today that freedom has been attacked by a faceless coward, and freedom will be defended. Not since Pearl Harbor was attacked on December 7th, 1941, has this country undergone such a devastating and damaging attack. And it may not yet be over. We do know at this time that at least 4 targets have been attacked. The 2 Twin Trade Tower centers here in New York City, the Pentagon, and then another plane that was crashed deliberately into an area outside of Pittsburgh. That is the second plane hitting the Twin Trade Towers this morning, all of them hijacked airliners. Then these 2 colossal icons of the American capitalist system collapsed in lower Manhattan. The death toll at this hour is unknown, but it is expected to be, as Mayor Giuliani has said, horrendous. Shortly after those attacks on the Twin Trade Towers in New York City, at the Pentagon, in one of the outer rings, another hijacked airliner crashed into 2 areas there, killing an untold number of U.S. military personnel in Washington, D.C. A code red was put in effect in the nation's capital. The White House, State Department, CIA evacuated along with the Pentagon. House Speaker Dennis Hastert was evacuated to a secure area. President Bush, who was in Florida for an appearance for an education project, was evacuated to Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana, where we do expect to hear from him before too long. The United States is in effect in a national state of emergency. All domestic flights were grounded immediately. Most flights that were already in the air, we believe, will arrive safely at their destinations. The borders between the United States and Canada and the United States and Mexico have been closed. Transatlantic flights were diverted to Canada. U.S. military forces in this country and around the world have been put on the highest possible alert. Aircraft carriers were moved to waters off New York City as this scene played out in the nerve center of this country, lower Manhattan, the financial markets, an area that is home to literally hundreds of thousands of people. They are still dealing with the carnage in lower Manhattan. We want to go now to NBC's David Bloom, who is in Midtown Manhattan, overlooking all of this. As you can see there, communications have been severely interrupted. David?
Well, Tom, what we're looking at behind us more than 4 hours after the first explosion is the smoking hulk of the essentially vanished World Trade Center. As you've said, the essential question at this hour in New York City is how many people may have died in these attacks. The various officials here in New York City believe that the casualty estimates will essentially go into the thousands and thousands of people. Here is the sequence of events as they happened at this hour. The first plane attacks the World Trade Center's South Tower at approximately 8:42 Eastern Time. Airline officials say at least 2 American Airlines flights and 2 United Airlines flights were hijacked today, and that the attack planes were the hijacked domestic flights. Roughly 21 minutes later, approximately 9:03 Eastern Time, the second large jetliner can be seen taking dead aim at the World Trade Center's North Tower. Emergency officials estimate 20,000 or more people may have been inside the 2 110-story buildings at the time of the attacks. Eyewitnesses report victims falling and in some cases jumping from the 2 buildings. At approximately 9:40 a.m. in Washington, D.C., a third hijacked plane crashes into the Pentagon in a burst of flames, one side of the building collapsing. Non-essential personnel from federal buildings, including the White House and the U.S. Capitol, are evacuated. 9:59 a.m., the South Tower of the World Trade Center collapses an unknown number of people still trapped inside. 1/2 hour later, at approximately 10:28 a.m., the North Tower of the World Trade Center collapses. Rubble, debris spreading for blocks. In a separate but apparently related crash, a fourth hijacked plane, a Boeing 767, crashes in western Pennsylvania, about 80 miles southeast of Pittsburgh. The FAA closes all domestic airports, shutting down all U.S. airspace. So again, Tom, 4 hijacked airplanes. We know what happened to each of the 4. Other officials investigating now, both apparently the worst terrorist attack in the mainland United States ever. Tom?
Thanks very much, NBC's David Bloom. What we don't know is who may be responsible for these attacks. There's a lot of speculation, obviously, about Osama bin Laden, who is a Saudi dissident who is believed to be harbored somewhere in Afghanistan, but no one is claiming responsibility. In the West Bank, however, the Palestinians in the streets are cheering and celebrating these attacks on the United States, even though Palestinian leaders have condemned the attacks. We want to go now to NBC's Pat Dawson, who is down near the World Trade Center, because the big question, obviously, in New York City and across this country, how many people have been able to survive this horrendous attack? Pat?
Tom, right now, hundreds of rescue workers are massed here on the southern tip of New York in Manhattan Island, waiting for a possibility where they can go back in large numbers to begin searching through the debris. Obviously, the first task at hand will be to find anyone who is still alive in there. There really is no precedent for this. 2 110-story buildings. First of all, the impact of those 2 planes into them, and then the buildings themselves literally tumbling down into the streets. It's the sort of thing that one assumes very few people could have survived. But the task of those rescue workers, and if you look behind me, you can see many of them massed down there. The task will be for them to go back in and to try to find anyone who is alive. First of all, that is, of course, the priority. They know. We have spoken to a number of them. Of course, common sense tells us as well they are going to find a very, very high number of dead bodies in there as well. No way. We have spoken to officials here with the police department and with fire. They all say the same thing. This kind of a catastrophe, there's no way of knowing how many people that they're going to find in there, how many people are dead, how many people are alive. There's really no way to know how difficult their task is going to be, going in there and trying to dig through the remains of 2 110-story buildings that are now lying at the bottom of Manhattan. Obviously, taking care of those that are hurt, that they have been able to get out, is a first priority. There are literally, I would say, probably a mile-long line of ambulances and rescue vehicles along this stretch of the West Side Highway in the lower part of Manhattan. Just on the right here is a community college in New York. That college is the triage center for those they've been able to take out. But I can tell you at this point that at least from this vantage point where we have seen most people going in and out, there have been, relatively speaking, very few ambulances going out of here in the last 3 to 4 hours. Tom?
All right, thank you very much, Pat Dawson. One of my colleagues who is right in the middle of the collapse of those buildings is CNBC's Ron Insana, who went down with a cameraman hoping to get close to the World Trade Center, and then it began to come down. The first one. Ron, take us through what you experienced.
Well, Tom, much of the area had been, in fact, cordoned off, and the cameraman from MSNBC and I were trying to get across to the west side of the World Trade Center in order to hook up with the rest of the NBC crews that we knew were there. As we were moving towards the building, we saw the top begin to blow out in a plume of smoke, and we heard the noise associated with an implosion. We turned and immediately ran for cover in the other direction as debris began to rain down. As we made our way, John going straight down the street, I taking a right turn around a corner, it got increasingly dark. The skies blackened as the material just continued to rain. President Bush now addressing the nation regarding the crisis.
Well, obviously,
a random parked car and hid there basically until the material stopped falling. It was pitch black, black as night inside that car, and for several minutes I remained there until some flickers of light were able to be seen. I made my way to a building and joined some police officers who were inside, and as the blackness began to lift and this gray thick smoke clung in the air, we were able to find a police car and make our way out of the area. The policeman stopping along the way to pick up 2 injured people and leave them at a Midtown hospital, and subsequently made my way here.
What about collateral damage to other buildings in the area? Those, of course, are the classic canyons of Lower Manhattan, and as that building came down, it did create a kind of tornadic wind that went through there.
Absolutely. Much like the images that were created for the movie Independence Day, when New York was exploding, the corridors of Lower Manhattan are so narrow and channel so much wind, even just on a plain windy day, that this material blew through in a way that was really unimaginable. It was truly frightening. It continued to rain down for several minutes, as you can see there, and the winds just whipped through these corridors for several minutes, eventually calming down to such an extent where there was just a thick gray haze throughout the entire area, Tom.
All right, thanks very much, CNBC's Ron Insana, who was right in the middle of it all today. New York City effectively has been shut down. All tunnels in and out of the city have been closed for security reasons. The airports are closed. The subways are closed. Traffic has been removed from the streets. All hospitals are on extra alert. One right kind of in the middle of it all at ground zero is St. Vincent's Hospital. And NBC's Robert Bazell is there, as he has been all morning. Robert, any additional word on casualties?
Well, Tom, actually there have been about 200 casualties, some of them very severe, at least 8 deaths, and 5 of those were firefighters or policemen. We're not sure which one. But one of the things that's amazing about being here is that it has been much slower than anyone anticipated. That's a lot of casualties, of course, and but the casualties have been coming out of Lower Manhattan at a much slower speed than people anticipated. I think just because as one rescue worker who had been down there told me, it's just hell down there. You can't move around. You can't discern who's a body part from a living human being in several of the areas. So we have a very dedicated staff standing by. Large numbers of medical workers are ready to attend to anybody who appears.
Bob.
Several have been very severely injured, but we're still waiting.
All right, Bob, we now have the videotape of President Bush, who was diverted from Florida to Barksdale Air Force Base near Shreveport, Louisiana. This is what he had to say to the nation moments ago.
Freedom itself was attacked this morning by a faceless coward, and freedom will be defended. I want to reassure the American people that the full resources of the federal government are working to assist local authorities to save lives and to help the victims of these attacks. Make no mistake, the United States will hunt down and punish those responsible for these cowardly acts. I've been in regular contact with the Vice President, Secretary of Defense, the National Security Team, and my cabinet. We have taken all appropriate security precautions to protect the American people. Our military at home and around the world is on high alert status, and we have taken the necessary security precautions to continue the functions of your government. We have been in touch with the leaders of Congress and with world leaders to assure them that we will do whatever is necessary to protect America and Americans. I ask the American people to join me in saying a thanks for all the folks who have been fighting hard to rescue our fellow citizens, and to join me in saying a prayer for the victims and their families. The resolve of our great nation is being tested, but make no mistake, we will show the world that we will pass this test. God bless.
President George W. Bush, in his capacity today, not only as President of the United States, but also as Commander-in-Chief, as U.S. military forces around the world are on the highest possible alert. There is so much uncertainty in this situation. Who is responsible? when it could happen again and where. These are questions that are still unresolved as we try to work our way through this day. I'm joined on the telephone now by the former National Security Advisor in the Clinton administration, Sandy Berger, a longtime veteran of national security matters in this country. Mr. Berger, in all of your contingency planning during your days in the White House, did you ever anticipate anything like this, 4 hijacked airliners that would be driven into the Twin Trade Towers and the Pentagon?
Well, Tom, I think for some time we have known that terrorism is the greatest security threat that this country faced. We've seen some horrible incidents here before. We broke up a multi-pronged effort on Millennium Weekend, but this certainly goes beyond anything that we have seen before in its dimensions and sophistication.
As we work our way through this day of shock and grief and still trying to count the number of casualties, we also have to say, however, that there has been a stunning failure of intelligence at the highest possible level. The American people are going to wonder why they spent billions of dollars of intelligence if we can't find out about a complex operation like this that involves so many people.
Well, I think all of that is going to have to be sifted out. I think that in the midst of our outrage and anger, President Bush is right. We have to show the world that we will respond to this both with determination and with steadiness. That means first, obviously, focusing on security and on rescue, then on determining who's responsible, and this is of such magnitude that it's inconceivable to me that we will not soon know what the origin of this is, and then how we did not detect this, since it obviously involved a multiple operation based on from the United States. But blame, I think. The blame game, I think, comes, in my judgment, after we do everything we can to take care of the people who are in those buildings. We assure the security of others who may be in situations that are vulnerable, and we find out who is responsible for this absolutely horrifying set of events.
Mr. Berger, it's just not a matter of assigning blame. That's not the question. The question is, how do we get our intelligence back on track so it doesn't happen again in the next 20 minutes or the next 20 hours?
Well, I think we have to recognize that this is the overwhelming security threat to the nation, more so than any foreign nation, more so than long-range missiles. Terrorism has been and continues to be the number one threat to our people. I think the intelligence community has intensified its efforts over the years, but this simply demonstrates that we're certainly not doing enough.
Sandy Berger, thank you very much for being with us today on what is obviously a day of great trial for this country, a great tragedy, and we have to determine how we go from here once we do begin to sort out just how many lives were lost, who is responsible for all of this, and how we can protect ourselves from this kind of attack again in the future as it continues to play out across America. Robert Knowles is on the phone with us now. He was on the 54th floor, I'm told, of one of the World Trade Center buildings when one of the planes was flown into it. Mr. Knowles, you're safely at home?
Yes, sir.
Could you turn down your television? I can hear it in the background, and that will cause us some problems if we continue our discussion. Okay. Tell me exactly where you were and what happened to you.
I was on the 54th floor.
Of number 1 building or number 2?
Number 1 building.
Uh-huh. And when were you first aware of the attack?
Well, something hit the building, and it knocked me to the floor. And then the whole window blew out of the office I was in. And it snatched the desk out of the office like it was a piece of paper.
And how did you get out of that office?
By the grace of God, I was holding on to the door so I wouldn't be sucked out the window.
And then did you go down the stairs?
Yeah, going down the stairs was really rough because it was from the 30th floor down, it was water. The sprinklers was on. And then I pray to God for the people in the wheelchairs because they couldn't get out. They were sitting there waiting for somebody to carry them down.
How many people did you see like that, Mr. Knowles?
2 people. They were invalids. You know, they couldn't get out the wheelchairs. It wasn't a regular wheelchair. It was the kind of wheelchair where they do everything in a wheelchair.
It was a heavy mechanical wheelchair of some kind.
Yes, sir.
And then as you made your way to the bottom of that stairwell, was crowded with other people trying to get out?
Yes, sir, but God bless the fact that it happened early, because if it had happened at 10:30, it would have been chaos because you couldn't get down the stairs. Between the smoke and the lights being out in the water, and the staircase was slippery.
When you finally got to the ground floor, then what happened?
Then they herded us out of the building. They told us to walk fast. We walked up towards Broadway, up Nassau, and it was glass blown from everywhere.
When you were in your office when the first explosion occurred, that was the first building that was hit?
Yes, sir.
And were there lots of people in the building at that hour?
It was a good amount of people, but not lots.
It was not full to capacity?
No, thank God.
And were there other people who, so far as you could tell, were either seriously hurt or killed in the first explosion that you could find?
No, everybody I seen was mobile. They were able to get out the building. You know, people were coughing, people fell on the stairs. They weren't hurt from the explosion. They were hurt trying to get out of the building.
Okay, Mr. Knowles, we wish you the very best, and by the grace of God, you were able to get out of there, and we know that this has been a difficult time for you, but we thank you for sharing your experience with us today.
Thank you.
Going to go to Washington now. Senator John McCain, who has declared this an act of war on the United States. It's already being described as a kind of 21st century Pearl Harbor. Senator McCain.
I think that's accurate in many respects, Tom, although clearly the implications of this are very significant, and including the fact that at least we knew exactly who it was that took these actions against the United States in Pearl Harbor. And obviously at this point we don't know who it was or which organization or nation may have been sponsoring this kind of activity.
We're obviously in the early stages dealing still with the shock and the grief, trying to count the number of casualties, but this country will have to take immediate action in terms of how we rearrange ourselves now to hope that we don't have this happen again. We're going to have some profound changes in America, Senator.
I'm afraid so. I think that our lifestyles will not be the same for a very long period of time because of security requirements. I also think that, as I was watching you earlier, there is going to have to be an evaluation about our intelligence capability, and part of that evaluation will be recognition that we don't have the kind of human intelligence capabilities that perhaps we need. We have excellent technical capabilities.
The European Union foreign ministers are to hold an emergency meeting on tomorrow. And we go to Mika Brzezinski, who is in Lower Manhattan. Mika.
Well, Dan, I'm with Larry Rosen. We're at PS 89, where his son goes to school. This school has been evacuated, and he's looking for his son. Larry is also looking for his daughter. She's 3 years old, and her babysitter. Larry, tell me exactly where they were, where your apartment is.
Well, I live in Gateway Plaza, which is directly across the street.
Airport and getting onto an airplane. That'll be one of the first, obviously, one of the first and necessary evaluations that are needed, because I think it's pretty clear now that these planes were hijacked, and how they were able to do that in the case of at least 4 airplanes is going to be a subject of great interest and perhaps some controversy, because there's been this issue of security at airports for a long period of time. How much inconvenience versus how much security, which has been one debate that's been in Congress and in other areas of government as well. So I think that rather than attacking it from having air cover over the Capitol, perhaps we ought to devote our efforts to going places where these acts of terror originate. That would probably be much more effective and cost-effective as well.
Senator, we're still dealing, as I say, with the initial stages of shock, but in fact, it is hard to overstate the magnitude of all of this or the continuing effect that it will have on the business of this nation.
I don't. There's never been anything like this in our lifetime. Pearl Harbor was a horrible and dastardly deed, and I don't like to compare it to Pearl Harbor. But this is unprecedented in its scope and frankly, its efficiency.
Senator John McCain, thank you very much for being with us today.
John.
Thank you. Under these very difficult circumstances. It's also worth pointing out that in Pearl Harbor, it was a military attack on a military installation. This was an attack by terrorists using innocent American civilians, for the most part, in hijacked airliners directed at targets filled with civilians, with the exception of the Pentagon, obviously. Let's go to NBC's Robert Hager now for an update. 4 planes hijacked today, Bob. 2 United, 2 American. Bring us up to date.
With a total toll just in the airplanes, so thousands dead presumably on the ground, but just in the airplanes, 266 dead. She said 2 American planes, 2 United planes. 2 of those planes were taking off from Boston, 1 from Newark, and 1 from Washington Dulles. 2 went into the World Trade Center buildings, 1 went into the Pentagon, and 1 crashed in rural Pennsylvania with no idea where that one was being hijacked to. At last report, and this report was about 40 minutes ago, there were now only 50 planes left in the air, 50 commercial flights over domestic U.S. airspace. So that is saying no new flights were being allowed to take off, haven't since 9:30 Eastern time this morning. The planes that were already in the air were allowed to continue on. There were only 50 of those still in the air. They were mostly about 20 minutes away from airports, so presumably almost all of those should have landed by now. There were also 22 international flights still in the air, heading here. Initially, the word was they were going to be diverted to Canada, and then the decision was made that that would be just too hard for Canadians to handle, and so those 22 flights were going to be allowed to land in the U.S. So far, we don't know of any of them landing. But this is a very important point. The FAA knew of no problems with any of those 50 planes still in the air in the U.S. or 22 in international airspace bound here. So that would seem to indicate that the problems are over in terms of these hijackings. Just to run the flights down very quickly, the first was an American airliner, Boston to Los Angeles. There were 92 killed on board that one. It went into the World Trade Center. That was the first event. Then there was a United plane leaving from Boston. 65 were killed on it. It also went into the World Trade Center. It, too, as the American plane before it, was supposed to have been bound Boston to Los Angeles. Then there was an American airliner leaving from Dulles Airport bound for Los Angeles, 64 aboard, and it crashed into the Pentagon. And finally, a United flight leaving Newark Airport bound for San Francisco. It went into rural Pennsylvania, so we don't know what its intended target was. Now, in terms of what Senator McCain was talking about, when you think of a plane being hijacked, you've got to get the hijackers aboard, and you have to get some sort of deathly weapon aboard, like a gun or some explosives. And there are 2 ways to do that. Either they go through passenger screening and manage to sneak through passenger screening without getting caught, or you get behind the doors somehow and sneak those people aboard behind passenger screening as though they were an airport employee. There have been investigations done on both those things. The FAA tests them a lot with plainclothes people to see if they get through, and every time they do it, a sizable percentage do get through passenger screening with mock weapons or mock explosives. And the same thing on the employees behind the lines. A sizable number do manage to get through the doors. So we'll be seeing in coming days what it was that led to all of this. Tom?
Bob, any indication from the FAA of radio traffic indicating that there was a hijacking underway?
No, what it is in the cockpit, presuming that an armed person, in the course of a hijacking, an armed person or somebody with explosives has broken into the cockpit, and the pilot, therefore, cannot say it over the open radio because the hijacker would take action against the pilot. So there's a button that you push, and the button sends out a code, and it tells the appropriate air traffic controllers, and word is flashed to Washington immediately that there's a hijacking in progress. So one could presume that that happened in all 4 of these flights. Of course, we don't know at the moment, but it certainly must have. Then you wonder, too, because the targets were hit so precisely, is that somebody standing behind a pilot and saying, okay, now fly this right into a World Trade Center tower? Or is it an experienced pilot, the hijacker himself, who gets the pilot out of his seat and takes over at the controls to guide it in at the last minute? We don't know, of course.
Yeah. All right, thanks very much. NBC's Robert Hager, who will be monitoring the airline part of all of this. The 4 hijacked airliners, in effect, became guided missiles in the hands of terrorists who hijacked the plane. They took innocent people to death with them, 266 altogether. President Bush is at Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana at this time. We're told other senior members of the Bush administration are in secure positions. There's code red at the Capitol right now. House Speaker Dennis Hastert was removed to a secure position. All financial markets have been closed down. All national monuments have been evacuated across America in places like Minneapolis, Kentucky, Los Angeles, and San Francisco. A number of critical installations have been closed down as well. This country, the most powerful in the world, has been, in effect, semi-immobilized today by these terrorist attacks. And we can only hope that they are now all over with. When we heard this morning at 8:42 that the World Trade Center had been attacked, we thought that that was a solitary and horrifying event. Not too long after that, the second one was hit. And then NBC's Jim Miklashevsky here on NBC said an explosion was felt at the Pentagon. And that was a plane that went into the Pentagon, another airliner near the helipad there. It fortunately was on the far side of the building from the most critical offices housing the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and the Intelligence Center, and of course Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld, who at first did not want to evacuate the building, and then he was persuaded that that was in the best national interest of this country to do just that. And then, of course, we had the situation in Pennsylvania where a United airliner crashed into the ground. It, too, had been hijacked. James Lee Witt is the former head of the Federal Emergency Administration in the Clinton administration. He was well known during his tenure there because there were so many natural disasters around the country. Mr. Witt, what is FEMA doing at this hour?
Well, Tom, I'm sure that they've already activated the Operations Center and also talking to the City of New York Emergency Management and Governor Pataki's office in putting together whatever resources they can to support their efforts in meeting that immediate need. And I'm sure they're probably activating some search and rescue teams. Probably. Go ahead.
I know, James, from our own experiences together that you had lots of contingency plans for tornadoes and for hurricanes, those kinds of natural disasters. What did you have in planning at FEMA for a terrorist attack?
Well, of course, you know, after the Oklahoma City bombing, Tom, we've worked very hard in putting together a very strong federal response plan in which they have continued to work on, particularly adding the terrorist component to that. And working with the FBI, who will have the lead on this, is in crisis management. And, of course, FEMA has a consequence management. And I'm sure Director Albaugh and all the staff there are liaisoning with the FBI at this time.
Was that something that you prepared on your own, or did you do that in close coordination and get regular updates from the FBI?
We worked very closely with the FBI, and if there was a threat, then they would notify us and work very closely with them, and as far as having someone in their operations center.
When you look at those pictures of what happened in lower Manhattan, in the canyons of this great city with those two 110-story buildings coming down, you can only imagine what the carnage must be on the ground.
It's probably horrifying, and I saw earlier said it looked like a war zone, and I'm sure it does, and just looking at the pictures. But, you know, there's so many firefighters and police officers that were probably up at the base of that building, probably in that building, trying to get people out, and I'm sure that, you know, the loss is going to be tremendous, and the pain is going to be felt for a long, long time.
Jamie Lee Witt, thank you very much. By the way, Afghanistan's ruling Taliban movement on Tuesday said that Osama bin Laden, they're closely allied with him, was not responsible for the attacks on the United States. What happened in the United States, according to the Taliban, was not a job of ordinary people. It could have been the work of governments. Osama bin Laden cannot do this kind of work. Neither can we, a Taliban spokesman.
Down as low as possible. And I'm very worried about a lot of my police officers and firefighters, some of whom I saw go into the building, and we haven't been able to find them yet.
Mayor, what are the possibilities that many people are still trapped in the debris?
There are people that are still trapped there, and there are parts of that area we can't get into right now because of the smoke condition and the fact that some buildings are still collapsing. We just got a report that 2 other smaller buildings in that area collapsed, including one that we were possibly in. So it's still a very dangerous situation for the firefighters and police officers that are there. but they're the best. I mean, they're the best in the world, and if whatever number can be saved, they will do it.
Mayor, you've just pointed out something that we were not aware of, that because of, when you have the two tremendous buildings, 110 stories high, both these buildings collapsed, then there are buildings around these two twin towers that have collapsed.
Now, I was in one of them, 75 Barclay Street, and when the first tower collapsed, it created a tremendous smoke condition. It hit our building. We were trapped in our building for maybe 10, 15 minutes. So there are other buildings there that are affected by this, and there's no question that there are people, many people, still trapped there that we can't save. So that's what the police department and the fire department and the emergency services people are working on furiously. And the governor has deployed, I think it's about 1,700 National Guard that will be ready to relieve our people later this afternoon.
What are the chances, Mayor, and everybody knows we're in the early stages of this, what are the chances that you're going to need help and support from outside the city, perhaps even outside the state, of fire departments, police departments, as was the case in Oklahoma City?
We have already received offers of help, and the urban search and rescue teams, I think at least 2 of them, if not 3, have been tasked by FEMA to come here. And they'll probably be here later today or tomorrow. So yes, we are going to need that help. We've already used hospitals outside the city of New York, in Westchester, in Nassau, in northern New Jersey, Rockland County, and we're working with fire personnel there to come into the city later today, tomorrow, and the next day to relieve our fire department, because this is going to be a terrible strain on them. Not only the people who are injured and hurt and worse, but rescue efforts like this really drain you. So we're going to need as much help as we can get. And we've had excellent coordination from Governor Pataki and from President Bush.
Mayor, we have reports from all over the city that hospitals in this city, and everybody knows New York has better hospitals than any other single place in the world, but that the hospitals are actually being overwhelmed.
The hospitals are absolutely overwhelmed. I was just on the phone with the director of St. Vincent's Hospital, which is the hospital that is the closest to where the attack took place. In fact, when I was rushing down there after the first plane hit, they were already deploying people, getting ready for triage, and they're overwhelmed. All the hospitals in the metropolitan area are overwhelmed, and we're getting a lot of help, as I said, from northern New Jersey, Nassau, Westchester. We'll move people there, and we are now, in order to take some of the pressure off the New York hospitals. That we are blessed with, 170 hospitals in New York City. So in that sense, at least we have 170 that we can call on, plus a surrounding area with another 200 hospitals that we can utilize.
Mayor, as the mayor of New York City, had you received information from intelligence agencies to be on any kind of special alert or special
no specific information of any kind, right up to the moment that it happened.
Didn't have anybody saying, listen, be on some kind of special alert because Osama bin Laden or somebody else may be striking?
Not other than what the situation has been for the last 3 or 4 years, where, obviously, given the tensions in the world, there's almost a continued alert, but nothing, no specific information, no warning of any kind. And I've checked both with the police department and the FBI, and they had no warning.
Mayor Rudolph Giuliani, I appreciate you speaking to us live on the telephone as we played some video.
I would just like to say to the people of New York and to the people of America that this country, the city of New York and the United States of America, is much bigger and greater than this, and we're going to overcome this. We're going to get through it. We're going to overcome it, and we're going to prove that democracy and law is our future, not this kind of vicious, horrible, inhumane kind of terrorism.
Mayor Giuliani,
thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan.
Dateline's Freeport, Louisiana, Barksdale Air Force Base. Air Force One is reported to have taken off from Barksdale Air Force Base, where we played a videotape what the president had to say there a short while ago, for, we're told, points unknown. Now, to bring you up to date quickly on what's happened, particularly for those of you who may be joining us late or just tuning in, plane crashed into one of the World Trade Center towers in lower Manhattan shortly before 9 a.m. this morning. Second plane crashed into the second tower of the World Trade Center shortly after 9 a.m. President Bush was in Sarasota, Florida, called the crashes at that time an apparent terrorist attack and a, quote, national tragedy. Then an aircraft of some kind crashed into a helicopter pad at the Pentagon, damage, including some fatalities there. The Pentagon, of course, just outside Washington, D.C. in Northern Virginia. That was about an hour after the first planes, plural, crashed into the first towers here in New York. The Federal Aviation Administration shut down all aircraft takeoffs nationwide. One World Trade Center tower then collapsed shortly after 10 a.m., about an hour after being hit by the plane. American Airlines said one of its planes that crashed into the World Trade Center was American Airlines Flight 11, hijacked from after takeoff from Boston en route to Los Angeles. Senior law enforcement officials said a car bomb exploded outside the State Department. Then later, senior federal officials said, well, no, that they might have been wrong about that. There was a report of a plane crash in the area of Camp David, the presidential retreat in rural Maryland. The facts on that have never been quite squared. And then there was what was described as a big plane crash, a strange one, near Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. All those have been the events of this day so far. No one doubts that the casualties are extremely high in the collapse of the World Trade Center buildings. You just heard live on the telephone, Mayor Giuliani did not even want to speculate how many, but when the thousands were mentioned, he just said he didn't want to contemplate that the loss of life has to be high. How high, no one knows in the crash of these World Trade Center buildings. So that's the situation at this hour. We have with us in our CBS News World News headquarters in New York, R.P. Eddy, former official of the National Security Council. Thanks for being with us. What government, quote, continuity issues went into effect today? I'm puzzled, I think a lot of people are, about what's happened with the president. Put this in some context. Give us some perspective, Mr. Eddy.
Well, the U.S. government has a plan called continuity of government that has been in place since the beginning of the Cold War to protect the constitutionally mandated succession of the executive. And when an event of this magnitude or this sort of threat appears, those programs go into effect and take the different principles that would potentially be in line of succession and put them in secure locations. So there's proximity issues and there's also protection issues. The president would, as he has here, quickly moved to Air Force One, which is a mobile command center that allows him a certain amount of protection and mobility, and other officials are moved to other secure locations throughout the country.
Why would the president not want to go directly to the White House and be seen in the center of the executive branch of government and in command there? Why not go directly back to the White House?
Well, the White House is the symbol of U.S. government, and it's the home of U.S. president, but it's also not the most secure location that one can imagine. Living in a democracy like we do, we expose ourselves to certain vulnerabilities, and we don't have our executive housed in armored cars. So the White House isn't an armored vessel. So the most secure location for him, and the place he needs to be, is wherever he is safe, and that doesn't tend to be the White House in a situation like this.
Was or was not the top levels of the government, were they not concerned today about a possible chemical or biological attack?
Well, I think when you have an event like this occurring, you have to recognize the psychology of the terrorists, if in fact it is a terrorist attack, and I can't imagine it's anything else, would be the same psychology that would drive them to do a chemical and biological attack. So if they were to undertake this kind of event, then you could suppose they would also be willing to do a chemical and biological attack. Although it should be noted that this kind of attack is much easier to pull off than an effective chemical and biological attack. This isn't a highly sophisticated terrorist attack. A chemical and biological attack takes a lot more planning and preparation.
On the basis of your experience in government as a former official with the National Security Council, would this kind of attack require some kind of state support for this act of terrorism?
I wouldn't want to make a guess on that question if it did or didn't actually have state sponsorship, but I don't think so. The reality is that a lot of the groups that would pull something like this would be ones that do have state sponsorship, and we know that. And I would bet dollars to donuts that we're going to find that whoever did do this did have state sponsorship of one degree or another.
R.P. Eddy, if you could stick with us here for a minute. We want to go to Elizabeth Caledon, one of our CBS News correspondents who's at Bellevue Hospital, one of the world's best-known hospitals here in New York. Elizabeth?
I'm standing by outside two of New York City hospitals, NYU Medical Center and Bellevue Hospital just down the street. The only way to describe it here is it's a scene of, I would say, organized chaos. There are hundreds of people lining up to give blood. Blood is going to be a big need in this situation. And also doctors rushing into work and family members looking for their loved ones. Now, Bellevue is one of the biggest trauma centers in New York City, so the majority of the most seriously injured patients will be taken here. The deputy director of emergency services here at Bellevue did tell me they have quadrupled the size of the emergency room. They have hundreds of doctors coming in from their days off, getting here any way they can to help with the situation. The way it's working is there is an emergency medical services team down at the site of the World Trade Towers. They are doing triage, determining which patients are the most severely injured and should be sent on to the hospital. And the doctors say so far they have no idea how many injured there will be. They are expecting thousands. They are prepared for thousands. They've gone through drills preparing them for this day many times, they say, and are also trying to cope with the psychological trauma of this situation. I'm Elizabeth Caledon, CBS News, reporting from NYU Medical Center and Bellevue Hospital.
This was videotape of Liz Caledon made a very short while ago. Now, the mayor of Washington, D.C. has declared a state of emergency there. According to the FAA, all U.S. commercial flights now have been accounted for, keeping in mind that the airlines have confirmed that at least 4 aircraft, commercial airplanes, were hijacked earlier in the day. American Airlines says that 2 of theirs, 1 each, hit the World Trade Center towers. So American Airlines says it was their hijacked planes, hijacked aircraft. What an incredible story this is. Hijacked planes crashed into the World Trade Center. Now, David Martin reports from the Pentagon. Remember, the Pentagon, an aircraft of some sort was crashed into a helipad. It caused damage and some fatalities and injured the Pentagon. David Martin now reports the aircraft carriers USS George Washington and John F. Kennedy have been deployed to New York with the amphibious ships, cruisers, and destroyers that are part of their normal battle groups. Keep in mind that aircraft carriers do not sail alone. Of course, they have very large battle groups with them, and that the battle groups centered around the George Washington and John F. Kennedy have now been deployed toward New York City. Some of those ships also coming up the Chesapeake Bay to Washington. That is, that some of the battle carrier groups from these 2 battle carrier groups apparently going to be sent up Chesapeake Bay to Washington. The ships will provide hospital beds, humanitarian assistance, and of course defense for those 2 cities. Both the Washington and the Kennedy are out of Norfolk, Virginia. Now, R.P. Eddy, formerly of the National Security Council staff, I know that there's a scenario that a state enemy of the United States might want to have an attack at or about the same time that some terrorist attack. What would the U.S. military as a whole be doing today under the plan?
Well, as soon as this attack was reported, a coordinating subgroup of the White House was immediately called to effect, and all the cabinet officials that were involved with that met via secure teleconference to discuss the intelligence about the attack and the preparations to deal with further attacks and to deal with the catastrophic effects of this. And then the final thing they would probably discuss is if they could establish culpability and what kind of response would be necessary if they are able to figure out, who is behind this, if it's a state sponsor or not. And that usually takes a little while, though.
And our State Department, which has been responsible for trying to pressure the Taliban government of Afghanistan to give up Osama bin Laden unsuccessfully so far, where would they be in all of this at the moment?
Well, the State Department will be responsible for all international diplomacy that we do vis-a-vis this attack, including talking to the Taliban, which we do through certain channels, actually here in New York, to explain to them that, and we have previously, that we hold them responsible for any attack that occurs against U.S. citizens by the Taliban, by the Osama bin Laden. So that message has gone out again. I'm sure that we've insisted that they give us any cooperation that they might be able to, and we've asked that of our allies and other countries around the world. Part of that will be intelligence sharing, and part of that will be deploying of resources.
R.P. Eddy, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
James Carlson, who was formerly head of the New York City FBI office and was the assistant director of the FBI, and is on the, not just on the telephone, he's with us now, former director of the FBI office in New York. Jim, it's good to see you again. put this in context and perspective for us, and to let our viewers and listeners know you were in charge of the investigation of the TWA 800 crash investigation, have a lot of experience with this kind of thing. Give us some context.
Dan, it's a huge event. It's a black day. In my view, it's a bigger event than Pearl Harbor. It's war. It's declared war, and we need to now pull together as a nation and accomplish a bunch of things.
Well, nearly everybody's been talking today about the FBI's role, and obviously the FBI has a large role, but the FBI alone cannot possibly investigate something such as this. What other agencies, what other resources the U.S. government be pulled in to find out who's responsible for this?
Well, all the intelligence agencies, the CIA, NSA, law enforcement at every level, work together on a daily basis as a team now. The idea, though, that we can know everything, and obviously we didn't know everything. When I say we, I'm talking about that team that I used to be a part of. This event happened, so we did not stop it from happening. It's terribly difficult in a free society with open borders, and on any given day, people land at Kennedy Airport and other gateways undocumented. It's very difficult, and particularly with Middle East terrorism, these cells are not joined together. The only thing that joins them together is their hatred for us, our way of life, our foreign policy.
Jim Kellstrom, you say that these various terrorist organizations are not necessarily as well connected as we sometimes might imagine them to be. Give us some perspective on who among the world's states helps them with what they do. I'm not suggesting that we know anything about who did this today, but the questions just tumble out. Well, can someone do this without some state support from someone like Iraq or Iran?
Well, you know, Dan, whether or not this is state supported, there has been state support over the years, and you know, if this was 1% or 10% or 100% state supported, I don't know. I'm a civilian now. I'm sure that the FBI and the agency and all the other intelligence apparatus of the free world, for that matter, is trying to figure out exactly who's behind this, and we need to act with massive power, in my view, without a lot of collateral damage, and that's difficult to do. But this is an act of war, and we need to act accordingly. Now is the time to step up to the plate and do the things that we need to do here as a country.
Jim Kellstrom, when you were still active with the FBI, true or untrue, that there were a number of terrorist acts in which the threads of evidence led back to certain states, but that for reasons, perhaps understandable reasons of diplomacy and what we call geopolitics, there was a tendency to say, well, we may know that, but we don't want to deal with it. True or untrue?
No, I think that's true, Dan. I think that obviously there has to be balance in actions that we take. I mean, these events look very clear once they happen. I mean, now that this horrific act has happened, and then we have untold dead people in New York and Washington and some airplane in Pittsburgh, it's crystal clear that we need massive, effective, high morale law enforcement, intelligence. We need to act as a unified country. We need to stop the hypocrisy. Not that hypocrisy got us to this day. I'm not saying it did. But this is serious business. And those of us in law enforcement over the years, and intelligence work over the years, didn't know what day this would happen, hoped it would never happen, but thought surely someday it might happen. I mean, we saw the World Trade Center bombing. We saw in the United States. Then we saw events, the Blind Sheikh going to blow up the Holland Tunnel, the Lincoln Tunnel, the United Nations building, the FBI building. We saw Ramzi Youssef plot in the Philippines, well, after he escaped the United States, to blow up 9 or 10 jumbo jets simultaneously. We saw the bombing of the Cole. We saw the bombing of the barracks in Saudi Arabia. We saw the bombing of our embassies in Africa. There's plenty of evidence that people hate us for who we are, what our foreign policy is. And we need to act. And we need to act together as a country.
James Kellstrom, formerly head of the FBI office in New York and a man who helped run the FBI for a long while. Thanks for being with us this morning. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Dan.
Rulers of the Taliban have rejected all suggestions that Osama bin Laden could be behind these attacks. We mentioned earlier that some leaders of the Taliban got out early to disassociate themselves from this whole thing. And the background of this is that by last reports, Osama bin Laden was in Afghanistan. There's been some pressure to get him out of there. The Taliban is responding today. The Taliban condemned the attacks, and they said that bin Laden had nothing to do with it. Tony Blair, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, is speaking. We go to him live.
The utter carnage and terror which has engulfed so many innocent people. We've offered President Bush and the American people our solidarity, our profound sympathy, and our prayers. But it is plain that citizens of many countries around the world, including Britain, will have been caught up in this terror. I have just chaired an emergency meeting of the British Government's Civil Contingencies Committee, and I would like to explain some of the measures that we have agreed to take here. There are a range of precautionary measures. We have stepped up security at airports to the highest levels. No flights will take off from the United Kingdom for which we cannot apply the highest standards of security for aircrew and passengers. Private flights have been stopped except where specifically authorised. Flight paths into London have been changed so there will be no civil overflights of central London. Security has been increased across the full range of government buildings and military premises. The police across the whole of the UK are on full alert. All our defence facilities around the world have been moved to high alert to ensure the protection of British service personnel. Advice has been given to major financial and business institutions about appropriate security measures. A number of other security measures have been taken, and of course we are in close touch with US, European and other allies and are cooperating with them on issues of security. All relevant ministers remain in communication, and the committee, the Civil Contingencies Committee, will meet again tomorrow at 8 a.m. Obviously, some of these measures, not least the effect upon airports, will lead to some disruption, and I hope people understand that. But other than the specific measures we have taken, or that we have advised others to take, business and everyday life can continue as normal. As for those that carried out these attacks, there are no adequate words of condemnation. Their barbarism will stand as their shame for all eternity. As I said earlier, this mass terrorism is the new evil in our world. The people who perpetrate it have no regard whatever for the sanctity or value of human life. And we, the democracies of the world, must come together to defeat it and eradicate it. This is not a battle between the United States of America and terrorism, but between the free and democratic world and terrorism. We therefore here in Britain stand shoulder to shoulder with our American friends in this hour of tragedy, and we, like them, will not rest until this evil is driven from our world.
Live from Great Britain, Tony Blair, the British Prime Minister, with his response and comments on what have happened today. In one of the most horrifying attacks ever on U.S. soil, terrorists crashed two airliners into the World Trade Centers today. This is a photograph taken at the time of one of the planes. American Airlines says it was one of their commercial airliners, crashes into one of the towers. This was around 9 a.m. Eastern Time this morning, about 5 hours ago. Another plane crashed into another tower. One of the towers began collapsing. The hope was that it would only be a partial collapse. It turned out to be a total collapse. Debris, including concrete and steel, raining down in a wide area around that building. And then incredibly, almost unbelievably, a short time later, the other tower began to creak and wobble and then collapse. Other buildings in the vicinity, as reported by Mayor Rudolph Giuliani in a live television report to CBS News a short while ago, also began to collapse. This was the scene just after the collapse of the buildings, New York City high school students being evacuated. Teachers and others counseling them, be careful as you flee.
Just dust, don't run.
At the World Trade Centers, some people jumped, were forced out of windows at high up. 110 stories were those buildings. This was the scene. Horrified spectators cried aloud as they saw one after another persons jumping or forced out of the building. There were secondary, then third explosions, and then a fourth explosion. Apparently, no one knows for sure, from the high-octane fuel and other causes in the interior of the building brought about by the crash of the two planes into the World Trade Centers. 4 aircraft, commercial aircraft, were hijacked during the day. 2 of them crashed into the World Trade Center buildings. Another apparently crashed into the Pentagon, where there has been some loss of life, how much we do not know, and there have been some injuries. And then another plane is believed, this has never been completely, totally confirmed, in the area of Camp David, the presidential retreat in Camp David, Maryland. FBI officials reported earlier the plane had crashed in that vicinity, but it's been a confused reporting situation about that since then. And then in western Pennsylvania, in the Pittsburgh area, there was a big plane crash there, details of which are still being sorted out. That was a crash in Somerset, Pennsylvania. So the North World Trade Center towers hit, then the South Tower hit, both collapsed. Plane crashed at the Pentagon, plane crashed in Somerset County, Pennsylvania, and one may, I underscore the word, have crashed in the vicinity of Camp David, Maryland. This is perhaps the most audacious terrorist attack that's ever taken place in the world. The most audacious terrorist attack ever taken place in the world, according to Chris Yates, an aviation expert with Janes in London. And he said it takes a logistics operation from the terror group involved that is second to none. He went on to say that only a very small handful of terrorist groups is on that list, and he names at the top of the list Osama bin Laden. That's quote unquote for Mr. Yates. However, we keep emphasizing no one knows who's responsible for what happened today. And you may want to note that on previous occasions, first reports about who was responsible for what turned out to be erroneous. It will be many hours, perhaps days and weeks, before it can be sorted out who, in fact, is responsible for these actions today. John Roberts is at our Washington bureau. John?
Well, Dan, let's first of all speak to the issue of whether there was or there was not any kind of a crash in the Camp David area. I spoke with Secret Service sources just a few minutes ago, Dan, who say that they have no evidence that there was any kind of a crash or an explosion or fire or anything near Camp David in the Catoctin Mountains of Maryland. They say that there was this aircraft that went down in the Pittsburgh area, which is still some distance from Camp David, but there was nothing, at least, probably I would think within a number of miles radius of Camp David, and nothing to suggest that Camp David may have been specifically targeted either. However, they do not know at this point where that aircraft that crashed in Pittsburgh was headed, whether it was indeed headed to Pittsburgh, whether it might have been trying to overfly the northern area of Maryland near Camp David. Perhaps it might have been headed for downtown Washington, D.C. as well, because there, of course, is that other aircraft that crashed into the Pentagon. And there appeared to be, at least from my perspective, Dan, upon arrival at the White House this morning, that when that aircraft went into the Pentagon, what had been a fairly mild state of alarm at the White House suddenly went to an enormously high state of alert. They evacuated the building within 5 minutes, and they cordoned off a number of blocks around the White House, not letting anyone back in. And as well, they evacuated the vice president and his staff. He is in charge of the Situation Room right now, off campus, not at the White House, though by all accounts still in Washington, D.C. He is there with his national security advisor and his chief of staff at his side. Lynn Cheney, his wife, also said to be in the same area as the vice president. But Dan, a development within the last 45 minutes that I certainly don't want to begin to appear to speculate on, but we understand, Dan, that the congressional leadership this morning, after the attacks, was taken from Capitol Hill. They were taken to a secure location for a while under the protection of the Capitol Hill police, and then they dispersed and were operating out of private offices. Well, CBS News has learned from congressional sources just recently that the leadership of Congress, the congressional leadership, has been gathered together and is being ferried by helicopter individually, not together, individually to a location outside of Washington, D.C. Now, of course, the big area that has been designated for Congress to go to in the event of a big national emergency, war, nuclear attack, is Weather Mountain in the western part of Virginia, Dan, but we can't say that that's where they've been taken. President Bush, after leaving Sarasota, Florida today, went to Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana, where he made his first statement after receiving a full debriefing of what had taken place in New York and Washington. Here's what the president had to say.
Freedom itself was attacked this morning by a faceless coward, and freedom will be defended. I want to reassure the American.
An unknown number of people still trapped inside. 1/2 hour later, at approximately 10:28 a.m., the North Tower of the World Trade Center collapses. Rubble, debris spreading for blocks. In a separate but apparently related crash, a fourth hijacked plane, a Boeing 767, crashes in western Pennsylvania, about 80 miles southeast of Pittsburgh. The FAA closes all domestic airports, shutting down all U.S. airspace. At this hour, airline and FAA officials believe the 4 hijacked planes include American Airlines Flight 11, a Boeing 767, bound from Boston to Los Angeles with 90 passengers and crew aboard, crashed into the South Tower of the World Trade Center. American Airlines Flight 77, bound from Washington Dulles to LAX, with 64 passengers and crew, believed to have been the plane, crashed into the Pentagon. United Airlines Flight 175, bound from Boston to Los Angeles, with 65 people on board. By early accounts, the plane which crashed into the World Trade Center's North Tower. And finally, United Airlines Flight 93, the Boeing 757, which crashed in western Pennsylvania, carrying 45 passengers and crew. As to who might be responsible for this series of terrorist attacks, as you mentioned, Tom, has yet no claim of responsibility, but we certainly can tell you what senior intelligence officials, both in this administration and in the Clinton administration, are telling us, that the prime suspect is clearly the Saudi-born terrorist Osama bin Laden. One official told us that only he has the capability, the experience, and the motivation to carry out an attack like this. But again, that is just their initial speculation, finger-pointing. We clearly don't know at this hour who's responsible for this devastating and horrific attack.
Thank you very much, NBC's David Bloom. It goes without saying that whoever is responsibility, this is an act of war declared on the United States, a terrorist act of war, unprecedented in our nation's history. The United States was attacked, of course, 60 years ago this year at Pearl Harbor. 2,400 people were killed. The Japanese military attacking an American military installation that got us involved in World War II. But this terrorist war, they used innocent Americans on commercial airliners to attack other innocent Americans, and they struck at the heart of our civilian life in New York City. And they've caused great psychological damage across the country as well, say nothing of their attack on the symbol of our military strength, that is the Pentagon. And they took innocent people to their deaths in Pittsburgh in the crash of that hijacked airliner as well. NBC's Rahema Ellis is down near the World Trade Center. Rahema?
Tom, I am 4 blocks from the World Trade Center. The sky is dark with thick black smoke. Apparently, there are still fires burning. Some of the emergency workers told me that they cannot get into the exact area of the World Trade Center to help people whom they fear are trapped in the rubble because the fires are still burning, in some instances, out of control. Just a few moments ago, and just only 2 blocks from here, we were at the NYU downtown hospital. It is the only emergency room in the lower portion of Manhattan. It was the place where the first victims from this blast were taken, and hospital officials tell us they have turned their cafeteria into a triage area. They have people lined, they say victims are wall to wall with inside that cafeteria and all throughout the hospital. Everyone has been called into service to assist in this blast. I talked with a man who was able to walk out of the hospital. His name was Peter DeCerbo. He was on the 47th floor of the World Trade Tower, number 1. He said when the first explosion occurred, he said he felt the building shake. He became frightened, as did all of his co-workers, he said. They didn't know what to do. Finally, he said, and quickly, they started to run down the stairs, 47 flights. And he said he actually carried a woman on his shoulders down those 47 flights with him. Another man who was on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange had come out of the building and was standing. He looked up, and he literally saw the second tower of the World Trade Tower come crashing to the ground. He said he saw it coming down, and then he and hundreds of people around him started to run. When he got to a point of some near safety, the man, who's 37 years old, said he dropped to his knees and he started to pray because he thought that he was going to be dead. As one emergency worker said to me, he said, "Do you know what day this is?" And I said, "It's September 11th. He said, "Yes, it's 911. And all of New York right now is in a state of 911. Tom?
All right, thank you very much. NBC's Rahema Ellis with a vivid account of what has been going on down there. We should also point out that we're getting a number of telephone numbers for people to call. Morgan Stanley has a very considerable facility in the World Trade Center. It's one of our premier investment banks, obviously, in America. And that number is 1-888-883-4391. For those of you who are in the New York area and may have families or friends who are employed by Morgan Stanley at the World Trade Center, it's a small city, those 2 towers. Some 50,000 people at one time or another could be passing through there during the course of a day. This was to be the New York primary day to pick the candidate who may succeed Mayor Rudolph Giuliani. That election has been canceled. The mayor spoke with reporters moments ago.
Our focus now has to be on trying to evacuate as many people as possible, save as many lives as we possibly can, and make the city as secure as possible. The subways are running in the rest of the city. Lexington Avenue is starting to run again, so people need to use the subway to get out of Lower Manhattan. They'll be able to use the subway. And we need people out of there so that the rescue efforts can go on all during the afternoon. I suspect they'll be going on through the night, and we'll be getting relief from the National Guard and the federal government later today.
Mr. Mayor, any indication on the ballpark number?
I don't want to. Obviously, there are all kinds of numbers that are swimming in my head as to what the numbers must be, but I don't know. I have no idea what the numbers are. It's horrible. I think any of you that saw this have probably never seen anything like this before. The people jumping out of the building, and it's a horrible thing to see.
In terms of the police mobilization, maybe the commissioner can tell us what's going on downtown. Have you brought in additional cops, presumably from all over?
There's additional resources coming from all over the city. We've activated off-duty MOS to come in. We're getting the assistance of New Jersey and the outer line counties, and they're all kind of pushing in toward Lower Manhattan.
Are either of you hearing anything from the federal government with regard to either what's going on in Washington or intelligence or anything out of the federal law enforcement?
The only thing that we've heard is what I guess is publicly available, that the Pentagon was attacked, that there were other apparent attempted attacks in other parts of the country, some of which were stopped. And I'm not sure I know how accurate all that information is, but it appears as if there have been either attacks or attempts to attack various parts of the United States.
Commissioner Bonnet?
That's Mayor Rudolph Giuliani of New York City. On that last point, he said that he had no confirmation of that. We have heard no word whatsoever of other attempted attacks across this country. Any number of states, as you might expect, and municipalities are on the highest possible state of alert. In Florida, Disney World has shut down and evacuated everyone from those facilities. That's been true of many of the entertainment centers in California as well. The Liberty Bell and Independence Hall have been closed, with other national monuments in the Philadelphia area. In Texas, some buildings were evacuated. Of course, all airports across America were closed down as well. In Washington, in Alaska, all military forces there are on the highest possible stages of alert. In Alabama, that's the home of the Redstone Missile Command Center, Marshall Flight Center. That has been closed today as well. No one knows if these terrorists might still attack again today. It does appear now, and I want to add a cautionary note to all of this. It appears now that this first wave of attacks is over. Let's go to NBC's Robert Hager now. Robert, do you know all the planes that were in the air that were not hijacked? Have they arrived safely at some destination?
That's a very, very important piece of information, and the FAA has just been able to confirm it, that the last of any scheduled domestic flights, last of the domestic flights that were in the air are now known to have reached their airports. So there is no other domestic flight that's unaccounted for. The implication is there's no other hijacked flight up there, that this is over as an event. Now, having said that, there are some international planes still in the air. There were 22 as of about an hour ago. Now the FAA is saying that's down to a limited number. So apparently many of those have landed at this point. The remaining international flights, they're all inbound, are headed for the West Coast. So they were, initially the idea was to divert them to Canada, and then they said they should land in the U.S. So those planes are still in the air, but in terms of these domestic airliners, as you say, there were 4 hijacked, 4 hit targets, and 1 went into a rural area of Pennsylvania, so that accounted for all 4 known hijackings. Now at this point, any other plane that's still in the air, and this is all triggered by the fact that the FAA put a hold on any new flights leaving airports as of 9:30 this morning. So these are the leftovers of those that were already in the air. Now they're all on the ground and all accounted for, so there appears to be no more threat in the air. Tom?
Any indication from the FAA on when they may lift the grounding of all flights in this country?
There is absolutely none, and I suspect that in spite of the pain it will cause the nation, that this is going to last for quite some time, because I wouldn't think they'd want to put craft back in the air until they know more about how this all came about. So I'm imagining at a minimum that this is going to last into tomorrow and could be beyond that, as again, in spite of the economic hardship to the nation and hardship to people. But I think we're in for a long haul here in terms of grounding air traffic.
Yeah, thank you very much, NBC's Robert Hager. It does pose all kinds of problems because people travel for reasons other than vacation. Obviously, business, you can deal with that as well these days with the internet and with faxes. But what about funerals or medical emergencies of one kind or another? We'll have to find a way of dealing with that within our air traffic system in America, too. And you can be sure that security is going to change radically in the next 24 hours when you go to an airport, because 4 airplanes were hijacked today. And they were used as guided missiles, in effect, by terrorists attacking American institutions. This is also having an effect overseas. The stock market in Germany has been evacuated because of a bomb threat. And in Great Britain, the Prime Minister has banned all civil flights over that country. Let's go to NBC's Keith Miller now in our London bureau. Keith?
Tom, an extraordinary ripple of shock, anger, horrific went right through Europe. At least 3 governments went into cabinet emergency meetings. Tony Blair, of course, canceled all civil flights. He also had a special emergency cabinet meeting. They evacuated several large buildings here as well. The horrific occurrence in the United States has rippled right across the world. Tony Blair had this statement to make a little bit earlier tonight.
I have just chaired an emergency meeting of the British Government Civil Contingencies Committee, and I would like to explain some of the measures that we have agreed to take here. There are a range of precautionary measures. We have stepped up security at airports to the highest levels. No flights will take off from the United Kingdom for which we cannot apply the highest standards of security for aircrew and passengers. Private flights have been stopped except where specifically authorized. Flight paths into London have been changed so there will be no civil overflights of central London. Security has been increased across the full range of government buildings and military premises. The police across the whole of the UK are on full alert. All our defence facilities around the world have been moved to high alert to ensure the protection of British service personnel. Advice is being given to major financial and business institutions about appropriate security measures. A number of other security measures have been taken, and of course we are in close touch with US, European and other allies, and are cooperating with them on issues of security. All relevant ministers remain in communication, and the committee, the Civil Contingencies Committee, will meet again tomorrow at 8 a.m. Obviously, some of these measures, not least the effect upon airports, will lead to some disruption, and I hope people understand that. But other than the specific measures we have taken, or that we have advised others to take, business and everyday life can continue as normal. As for those that carried out these attacks, there are no adequate words of condemnation. Their barbarism will stand as their shame for all eternity. As I said earlier, this mass terrorism is the new evil in our world. The people who perpetrate it have no regard whatever for the sanctity or value of human life. And we, the democracies of the world, must come together to defeat it and eradicate it. This is not a battle between the United States of America and terrorism, but between the free and democratic world and terrorism. We therefore here in Britain stand shoulder to shoulder with our American friends in this hour of tragedy, and we, like them, will not rest until this evil is driven from our world.
The British Prime Minister very eloquently put into words what many world leaders are telling both their cabinets and their armed forces. The Germans called this act in America mass murder. The French said it needs to be eradicated. Tom?
NBC's Keith Miller, who is in our London bureau tonight with a roundup of European reaction and specifically the reaction of British Prime Minister Tony Blair. On the phone with me now is Warren Rudman, former senator from New Hampshire, national security affairs expert and co-chairman of the U.S. Commission on National Security. Senator Rudman, we've been hearing from one official after another that they were not surprised that there was a terrorist attack, but they were stunned by the complexity and the efficiency and the sophistication of this one. Do you share that?
No, I don't. I certainly was not surprised, and I'm not the least bit surprised at the extraordinary efficiency in which these horrible people carried out this attack against defenseless American citizens. But, you know, from what I have looked at over the last few years, we're dealing with some very sophisticated people who are very well financed and, given the time, can carry out attacks of this kind, as well as the thing that we all worry about, and that is attacks with weapons of mass destruction, as opposed to today's attack, which was a weapon of mass disruption.
But this had so many moving parts to it. Where was our intelligence community?
Well, of course, Tom, the first thing people want to ask is that question. It's a legitimate question, and we've looked at it, and we looked at it in our commission, which, of course, defined this issue as the #1 security issue facing America. Unfortunately, these are very difficult targets to penetrate. Some of these organizations, we don't even know that they exist. You can't get operatives into their midst. Very hard to find out who they are, where they are. My suspicion is that the people who carried out these attacks are people who have been probably filtered into this country over a period of months or years, and have planned the attack and found a way to penetrate airport security. Once they did that, and they had people able to operate the aircraft, obviously what followed is no surprise.
Senator, how is this country going to have to change in the immediate aftermath of this declaration of war? And it's nothing short of that.
Well, it is a declaration of war. I compared it this morning in many ways to the country's attitude about defense in the 1930s or 1940, and then Pearl Harbor happened, and this country galvanized itself into action. This is another Pearl Harbor. This is a horrible attack on defenseless American citizens. I'm sorry to say I don't think it's the last. We have to do a lot with our intelligence, but more importantly, I think we have to do something about reorganizing our defense of this homeland into a rational organization that can deal with the aftermath, which, as you in New York can see, is just too horrible and too complex to contemplate. We've got to do that, and I must say that both the Congress and the administration have reacted to our report, which was issued in March. People are starting to look at ways to do this. It will take some time, but I hope not too much time.
There was going to be a very big debate in Washington, as you know, about the missile defense shield and about the reorganization of the United States military. Do you think the emphasis will now shift?
Well, Tom, I can only speak for the 12 or 13 members of this commission, and I will read to you just one short sentence. And we said, quote, "This commission believes that the security of the American homeland from the threats of the new century should be the primary national security mission of the U.S. government. With all due respect to the things you speak of, it is our collective belief that this nation has to organize itself both to try to prevent these things from happening and, as important, to find ways to deal with them when they do happen, as they will inevitably with the kind of determined foe that we are facing."
Thank you very much, former New Hampshire Senator Warren Rudman. We are looking at stunning pictures once again of people in lower Manhattan as they began to flee the canyons of Manhattan when the World Trade Center, first one building, one tower, and then the other began to come down. There is a real funnel effect in those narrow corridors in lower Manhattan, and the winds did take on a kind of tornado-like force. Ron Insana and others who work for NBC who were in the midst of all that described it as pitch dark and terrifying for a full 2 minutes at least. Many of them had to seek sanctuary either by breaking through windows, as Ashley Banfield did, into an apartment building, or getting into a car. CNBC's Ron Insana remains with us now. Ron, you've now been able to see those other videotapes that we've been showing of what it's like down there, and I think you used the phrase earlier, nuclear winter, and that's so apt.
And Tom, in some ways, I mean, if you can envision again that scene in Independence Day, that terrifying alien movie that showed New York City exploding in a horrific fireball without the fire, that is exactly what the corridors in lower Manhattan looked like. That's those huge plumes of smoke ripping through the streets and really overwhelming the entire community. It stretched for many, many blocks, the after effects of the implosion of that building. And to be standing in the middle of it, it was indeed pitch black. And had there not been an open car in which to hide, I'm not quite sure in what capacity I would be right now. But for quite a considerable time after the building came down, the air in lower Manhattan was thick, deep gray, unbreathable in many ways. Many people trying to take refuge in buildings that were open to the extent that there were some, or in automobiles, or any place where they could get breathable air.
All right, CNBC's Ron Insana, who was one of the survivors today when he went through to cover the story, and then the building began to come down. No one could have anticipated that it would happen as swiftly or as catastrophically as it did. It does lead one to wonder whether there was a secondary explosion of some kind within the building, although it did take, in both instances, a terrible, terrible hit at the top. These buildings are secure. The World Trade Center was bombed in 1993. It managed to survive that. But nonetheless, the full effect of these two airliners, both considerable in size with a lot of fuel on board, brought down two of the iconic buildings in Manhattan. Let's go to NBC's Andrea Mitchell now, who has been keeping track of national security matters and the State Department. Secretary of State Colin Powell is en route back from Peru, we're told. Andrea, do we think he'll come to Washington?
That's correct, Tom. We're not sure that he will come to Washington. He's en route back from Lima, Peru. He was to have gone to Bogota, Colombia today, never got that far. He was at an OAS, an Organization of American States meeting in Lima, Peru, and gave a statement about this terrible attack on our nation, an attack which he described as a military attack, and then left. We're not sure where he is going to be going. As you know, the vice president is at a secure location, Mrs. Bush at a secure location. Condoleezza Rice, the National Security Advisor, was conducting National Security Council meetings in the Situation Room at the White House, even though the White House was evacuated. The State Department Operations Center relocated across the river to another location in Virginia. And George Tenet, the CIA director, was still holding meetings, but in a secure, separate location in Langley, while the rest of the CIA did evacuate. The CIA director on February 7th testified to the Senate Intelligence Committee that there was one person who was capable of coordinated, sophisticated, multiple attacks on the United States with no warning, and that was Osama bin Laden. Now, obviously, there are other collateral groups such as Al-Qaeda in Egypt, based in Egypt, that are closely associated with him, and it's very easy to, as Warren Rudman has warned us against, to speak without knowing fully who is really responsible. But clearly, he is top on their list of possible suspects because of motive, because of means, because of opportunity, because of finances. And as Senator Rudman pointed out to you, this is the kind of attack, Tom, that had to be organized for many, many months. Just as we discovered during the testimony by bin Laden associates who were turned by the FBI and testified in the World Trade Center bombing trial, and also in the trial, of course, of the embassy bombings. These people work for months in advance. This is not a response, let's say, to recent events in the Middle East. This is something that was in the planning for many, many, many months.
Yeah, this is a terrible wake-up call for America. So many times we're lulled into the impression that far-off events don't have an effect on us in this country, or when there is a shooting at the CIA, as there was a few years ago, or when we had the bombing of the World Trade Center. Those trials went on, didn't generate a lot of attention. But, Andrea, let's talk for just a moment, if we can, about foreign policy in the United States, about what was on the agenda before this day. The president was going to China in October. The UN meeting will be coming up in the fall. How will all this be affected?
Well, all of these events will be affected in extraordinary ways. We had already seen that economic and global meetings could no longer be held without not only the threat of protests, but without massive protests interrupting the schedule of international gatherings. The UN meetings in New York in September were already going to be very, very difficult to conduct, always have been, as you know. But now it is difficult to imagine how the president can travel safely, how other officials can gather for these international meetings without such an extraordinary degree of protection that the meetings cannot be held as originally envisioned and cannot be held really very effectively. We've seen not only the comments from Europe, but we've seen comments from the top leaders in China and elsewhere, all government leaders horrified by what has happened here in the United States. But this really will change us in profound ways. You and Tim Russert were talking about the psychological effects. We thought after the embassy bomb attacks, when airport security was stepped up so importantly, that we were in a new world. But now we've seen, much to the shock of most Americans, that we are vulnerable to hijackings. We thought that hijackings were events of the 80s domestically here in the United States, not of the late 90s and turn of the century. So this is really a new world as far as our own sense of vulnerability, especially as we travel.
Thank you very much, NBC's Andrea Mitchell. We're told now by the FAA that the ground stop, that is all flights in this country, commercial flights and other private aircraft, have been grounded until at least noon tomorrow. Let's go to NBC's Robert Hager, who's been monitoring the situation for us at the FAA. Bob?
Right, Tom. It's all domestic flights, all commercial domestic flights. The prohibition on takeoffs and landings lasts at least until noon tomorrow, and then at that point they'll reassess it, so it may go beyond that. And then the same holds for international flights. All outbound flights to Europe and Asia, or anywhere, South America, and any inbound flights from overseas or foreign countries, all that is grounded at least until noon tomorrow, and then the agency will reassess it after that.
Bob, when you said all commercial flights will be grounded, what about private planes as well? There's a huge traffic in that these days.
Yeah, and it would apply to all private flights as well. Now, there are some areas where it's more difficult for the FAA to police because they don't have the towers and they don't have the airports manned. But it is to be a ground on all air travel. And I wouldn't be absolutely positive on all of the general aviation flights. And I know, of course, there'll be some exceptions for humanitarian reasons where you have to move particularly people who are dealing with this crisis here and there. So there'd be those sorts of exceptions. But what I do know is that scheduled domestic flights and scheduled international flights, inbound and outbound, everything is grounded until midday tomorrow.
All right, thanks very much. NBC's Robert Hager. We've been talking about this in a kind of large sense without personalizing it because we don't know, first of all, how many people were killed altogether. 266 died in the airplane crashes. We can only suspect that some of them will be well known because these were flights from Washington, from Boston to Los Angeles. That was American Airlines Flight 11. That was the first one to go into the World Trade Center. 92 people on board. Flight 77 and another American Airlines flight was headed from Dulles to Los Angeles with 62 on board. Those flights from the capital to the West Coast always have prominent people on board. Flights 175, United Airlines, Boston to Los Angeles, 65 on board, and Flight 93, Newark to San Francisco, 45 on board. All transcontinental flights with a heavy load of fuel. This is Mayor Giuliani of New York City. Let's join his news conference live.
It's something that we've had nightmares about, but probably thought wouldn't happen. My heart goes out to all of the innocent victims of this horrible and vicious acts of terrorism. And our focus now has to be on saving as many lives as possible. We have hundreds of police officers and firefighters who are engaging in rescue efforts in Lower Manhattan. I want to thank Governor Pataki for the incredible cooperation and coordination, and including deploying the National Guard that will be available to relieve our police officers and firefighters and emergency workers in the next couple of hours. The governor and I just spoke to the President of the United States. The coordination with the federal government from the time of the first attack has been excellent, including closing off the airspace around Manhattan and doing everything that can possibly be done in the face of this barbaric act to make the city secure. And we will strive now very hard to save as many people as possible and to send a message that the city of New York and the United States of America is much stronger than any group of barbaric terrorists, that our democracy, that our rule of law, that our strength and our willingness to defend ourselves will ultimately prevail. And I'd ask the people of New York City to do everything that they can to cooperate, not to be frightened, to go about their lives as normal. Everything is safe right now in the city, and the people who are doing the relief effort need all the help they can get. And then, Governor, thank you very much for your assistance and your help and your support. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor, for your leadership through this crisis. This is a vicious attack upon New York. It's an attack upon America. It's an attack upon the whole concept of freedom and our way of life. And we cannot let these attacks succeed. The first step has to be to make sure we do everything in our power to protect the people and to save the lives of those whose lives are still at risk and to help those who have been injured. And I want to commend the mayor, and I want to thank my colleagues from Connecticut, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and the federal government have all offered and made ready support to help us deal with this ongoing crisis. The people of New York are not only the freest and most diverse people in the world, we're also, I believe, the most capable of rising to meet the challenges of this type of attack. And right now, we want New Yorkers to remain calm, to go about their business, to appreciate the fact that everything to provide for their safety is being done, to appreciate that everything that can be done to provide for the health and the needs of the people who are still at risk is being done, and that we will continue to work to make sure that we get through this as strongly and quickly as possible. I want to thank the federal administration. Secretary Thompson has been on the phone with me a number of times, as well as the president, for what they are offering and prepared to do. And we're just confident that, well, this is a horrible attack and one that is despicable and really unthinkable in its magnitude. We will get through this. and we will continue to have a great and free country, state, and society.
Do we know the number of casualties at this point, sir?
I don't think we really want to speculate about that. The number of casualties will be more than any
Mayor Giuliani
of us can
and
bear.
Governor Pataki, the two Republican leaders of this state, joined together here in this day of common tragedy for them and dealing with a crisis of unbelievable proportions for both of them. Is this city has been struck in an act of war by terrorists. You're looking now at the Manhattan Bridge, which leads out of lower Manhattan into the various boroughs. That one going over into Brooklyn. Those of you who come to New York always remember the Brooklyn, Manhattan, and Williamsburg Bridge in that sequence from the lower part of the city on BMW. These are people who didn't have access to subways or cars because the tunnels are closed, and they're walking home, as any number of people are. New York, as Governor Pataki said, is so diverse in so many ways, but it is always united with the enormous sense of pride and survival and people helping each other as they are today. And that is the lower end of Manhattan, one of the great cities in the world that has been struck in an act of war today by two hijacked airliners. The hijackers unknown. Richard Shelby of Alabama, Senator, Senate Intelligence Committee. We're told that you've been getting a briefing. What do we know at this hour, Senator?
I've had a partial briefing, but after 4 o'clock this afternoon, I've been told that some people with the CIA and the FBI is going to brief Senator Bob Graham, who is the chairman of the committee. I'm the vice chairman. I was a former chairman. As to the events, what they know up to this point, who's responsible at this point. It's a little premature, but about 30 minutes ago, I was talking to some people. Everybody's deeply concerned about what happened. We should be. You mentioned war. This is war. I've said several times that this is a different type of war. It has no boundaries. We've been pushing the intelligence committees for 7 years now that I've been on the committee to do everything they can, and I think we've got to do more. But my first thoughts, Tom, go out to the families. You know, this is a terrible, terrible day for America. It's a wake-up call, though.
And what do we do after we get the wake-up call in terms of how this country must change? Obviously, security at airports will have to be tightened considerably when you have 4 planes taken, including one from the nation's capital. What else is going to have to happen?
Well, that's one, and I think we can do much better around the airports. I think we've come a long way with security. We're an open society. We want to stay that way because that's what makes this country great. We cannot hunker down and live in bunkers. We will not, I predict. But I think we can do a lot more. I'm waiting the briefing as to see if there was any inkling, any warning whatsoever. If not, then this was a heck of a well-executed, dastardly deed today. And I'm afraid it'll be more.
And that's the other question I was going to ask you in that partial briefing. Did you get any assurance that the worst seems to be over?
No, they wouldn't say that. They would be very careful as to saying what would come next because nobody knows that. But we are on alert. The president has put the military on alert all around the world. That's good. I guess we're going to have to stay on alert to some extent, be alert to possibilities because this is a dangerous groups that we're dealing with now.
Is the president going to have to stay out of Washington for 24 hours?
I don't know. I'll leave that up to him. He will be advised by the people who give him security warnings and so forth. But I think sooner or later the president will come to the Capitol. He should come to the Capitol and reassure the American people. But that will be up to him, Tom.
All right, Senator Richard Shelby, Vice Chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee, thank you very much for being with us today. We'd like to be able to talk with you again if we can after that 4 o'clock briefing. I know you can't give away details, but if we can invite you back, Senator, we'd like to do that. Let's go to NBC's Campbell Brown now, who is covering the White House from outside the fence. Campbell.
Well, Tom, we don't know where the president is right now, and that is, of course, deliberate given the security concerns. They are going to great extremes to protect him at this moment. He started off the day in Florida, then flew to the Barksdale Air Force Base, which is in Louisiana, near Shreveport, North Louisiana. And it was there that he made a statement reacting to the attacks this morning. Let's listen to what he had to say.
Freedom itself was attacked this morning by a faceless coward. And freedom will be defended. I want to reassure the American people that the full resources of the federal government are working to assist local authorities to save lives and to help the victims of these attacks. Make no mistake, the United States will hunt down and punish those responsible for these cowardly acts. I've been in regular contact with the Vice President, Secretary of Defense.
Now, Tom, we are told that the president took off from Barksdale Air Force Base for an unknown location. There are any number of places that he could have been taken. The most likely is a series of command centers that are set up across the country, all over the country, that are essentially communication centers where the president could speak with the military, where he could have access to the latest intelligence information. And the military officer who travels with the president at all times, this is the military officer who carries the nuclear codes. He also has a database with him of all of these communication centers around the country. All of them, or most of them rather, underground, where the president could both be protected and have that access, the most advanced electronics equipment that could give him access to his entire team, whoever he needed to talk to. Two in particular are worth noting here. One is Camp David. Underground at Camp David, there is a facility there, a special communication center, and of course Camp David is in Maryland along the Pennsylvania-Maryland border. There is another place in that same location, Waynesboro, Pennsylvania, near the Pennsylvania-Maryland border, again called Raven Rock. And Raven Rock is the alternate National Military Command Center or Communication Center. If the Pentagon is the primary place where military operations are conducted from, Raven Rock is the backup location. Now, these two are worth noting, and we have no confirmation that they are in any way related to the plane crash near Pittsburgh, but they are in the vicinity of that plane crash in Pittsburgh and possibly could have been targets. Tom?
Thank you very much, NBC's Campbell Brown. As these stories begin to unfold throughout the day, we're still operating really on two planes. It is surrealistic, but at the same time, it is one of the darkest days in America as we realize that this country has been attacked in an act of terrorist war in the heart of the nation's capital in Washington, D.C., and also in New York City, and then a plane that was driven into the ground outside of Pittsburgh. We believe that that is the end of the attacks for now, but no one is sure because we don't know who is responsible. Let's go to NBC's Jim Miklashevsky, who was in the Pentagon when that plane was driven into the Pentagon today. He heard a small explosion. Don Rumsfeld wouldn't get out at first, but I gather he too has been taken to a secure location.
Actually, Tom, what Don Rumsfeld did, according to Pentagon officials, is he was in his office on the opposite side of the building from where you see where the plane impacted, and he ran to the area where the fire and the fireball was still engulfing much of the Pentagon. And according to Pentagon officials, he actually assisted in helping some of the injured leave the building before he then returned to his office and then went straight to the National Military Command Center, again on the opposite side of the Pentagon, to monitor events where he now remains. Tom, this airplane that ran into the Pentagon, it happened within the hour from the two planes that ran into the World Trade Center, but it took a full 4 hours before firefighters and rescue workers could actually contain the flames and fire inside, so it was safe enough for them to enter the building. And that was about an hour ago when we were told that rescue workers did enter parts of the building where you can see where the plane sliced through the Pentagon. Now, it was actually fortuitous that the plane hit in this area, if that can be described as fortunate at all. As you see, Tom, the plane sliced through the building. It came in at an angle, flipped over on its right side, and hit actually at about the first and second floors. The third, fourth, and fifth floors were still intact immediately after the blast, but then later collapsed upon themselves. But to the right of that devastated area, you see there's not much fire damage. That's because that part of the building had recently been renovated with reinforced blast walls to prevent a kind of bomb attack, not an airplane attack, of course, but to prevent a bomb attack, and reinforced firewalls on the inside after the bombing at Oklahoma City. When the remodeling of the Pentagon was begun, it was decided to do it with extra reinforcement after Oklahoma City. Now, this area to the left, where you see most of the fire damage, that area was due to be remodeled shortly. And fortunately, a large number of those offices had already been evacuated. Now, there are confirmed dead, many injured. We don't know the exact number yet. And as rescue workers dig through that rubble, certainly the death toll here is going to climb. But really, it could have probably been much worse had this area on the right not been reinforced and the area on the left not been abandoned, really, to permit the redevelopment or reconstruction work that was to go underway. Now, according to eyewitnesses, it was an American Airlines 757 that came sort of from the direction of National Airport, and it just cleared the highway, which is adjacent, the highway ramps, which is adjacent to the Pentagon. But then it came in, and as it approached the Pentagon, almost at ground level, did a very hard right turn and actually flipped on its side and then sliced into the Pentagon on the first and second floors we see there. Tom?
Thank you very much, NBC Jim Miklashevsky. In both that flight and the first flight, the American Airlines flight that hit here in New York, had similar patterns. They were flying at very, very low altitude, 1,000 feet, according to some New York witnesses. And Bob Kerr said earlier that over Lafayette Park, just outside the White House, they saw a plane go over at a very low altitude that was out of the normal flight pattern for Washington, D.C. So obviously this had been well thought out. That goes without saying. The question is, what happened in the cockpit? Did the terrorists take the controls and drive those planes into the World Trade Center as well as into the Pentagon? And where was that plane that went down in Pennsylvania headed? Why did it go down there? Well, these were all flights that were originally headed for California. We don't have the tapes, obviously. The black box may be able to tell us something. This is the second plane going that you can see entering from right to left there, that hit the second Trade Center tower at the World Trade Center here in New York, causing that enormous fireball. That is the first tower to go down. It was hit a little bit lower. It went down first, and the second one went down as well. So there are so many unanswered questions here. All across America, we know that people are watching with horror and with a great deal of apprehension. There are lessons to be learned from past experiences. Oklahoma City comes immediately to mind. Assistant Fire Chief was John Hanson, who became a very familiar figure and a friend to a lot of us, who's been through all this. He's now retired from the department in Oklahoma City. John, first of all, this whole business of getting people out of the rubble in New York City and in the Pentagon, but the larger lessons about what we should learn about how we move on from here. What did you learn in Oklahoma City?
You know, Tom, that we can in fact do that. We were, stung, we were wounded, but we're not going to be defeated, and we won't in this one. You've heard the president, Mayor Giuliani, the governor of New York, all make the comments that we're going to stick together and get through this. We've got to be patient. We've got an incredible rescue effort that's going to take possibly months. You know, our rescue effort in Oklahoma City took 17 days. This, with the widespread destruction, will probably go into the months. We've just got to be patient and pull together and just take this head on.
There's so much that we learn from Oklahoma City as well in terms of rescue organization and rescue techniques.
You know, Tom, we had a team from the great state of New York in Oklahoma City. After Oklahoma City, the nation's fire service, FEMA, we all got together, reevaluated what we were doing, The New York City Fire Department is as prepared as any department in the country to handle this. With the support of FEMA and the rest of us around the country, we're going to help those great men and women get through this, just as they helped us back in 1995.
John, tell me, just from a personal point of view, where were you when you heard what had happened today, and what was your first reaction?
Tom, I was at home, and I heard about the devastation during the Today Show, watching Katie and Matt. And it just felt like I'd been gut punched, as the rest of the country. I stopped for a moment, looked at the video that we saw on the Today Show, and just really couldn't believe it at a point. And then reflected on Oklahoma City, and knew that we all had to go to work, band together, and help each other get through this. And we will. That's the beauty about America. We'll pull together, and we'll get through this and send a message to the cowards who perpetrated this great crime against our nation.
Thanks so much. John Hanson from Oklahoma City, who went through his own trial by fire and shares with us today some of the lessons after the Murrah Federal Building was bombed, and he became such a familiar and reassuring figure to so many of us. We have some information that I can bring you up to date on now. The mayor here in New York said that 1,500 people have been brought to the Liberty State Park area, that is in the lower end of Manhattan, for those of you who come here from time to time, not too far from where the ferries go back and forth to Staten Island and over to the Statue of Liberty. 600 have been brought to the New York City area hospitals. 150 of those are in critical condition. New Jersey hospitals have not yet reported in. It's fair to say that that's about 2,100 altogether. Those are the people who have been recovered. We can only guess at how many hundreds more are trapped in the rubble on the ground or in what is left of the buildings. 30 patients, this is in the Washington, D.C. area, 30 people have been brought to Arlington to the hospital at the VA Center in Arlington. 13 have been admitted, 8 are in intensive care, 4 are on ventilators. They have discharged 6 patients so far. There are a variety of injuries, blast injuries and smoke inhalation, which is always a huge problem. Burns, fractures, several patients are critically ill. Perhaps 8 altogether. There have been no fatalities brought to that hospital, the VA Center in Arlington, although earlier the Pentagon did say that there were people who were killed in the attack on the Pentagon. St. Mary's Hospital in Hoboken, back to New York again. 450 people have been brought at the Hoboken PATH Station Triage Center. PATH is a train that goes underneath the river over to New Jersey, and so they were treating him right there as a triage center. Mostly minor injuries. Of those injuries are cuts, bruises, burns, broken bones, and so on. So that's a quick update on what is going on at LAX, which is closed down, as are all airports across America. NBC Shelley Smith reports authorities may soon detonate a suspicious device found at the airport. On a day like this, there are any number of suspicious devices and calls that are made by demented people claiming that there's a bomb on board a plane or a bus or in a school somewhere. We're trying to track those down. There have been no other incidents so far as we know across America beside those that we have been witness to here at the World Trade Center, at the Pentagon, and of course that plane that went into the ground outside of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. NBC's Robert Hager. Robert, what's the latest there at the FAA?
Tom, you were mentioning about imagining what could have gone on in the cockpits, and really there are 2 basic scenarios in a hijacking. Either you have the hijacker standing there with a gun at the pilot's head or an explosive device of some kind ordering the pilot to make the maneuvers on the plane, or you have the hijacker actually taking over from the pilot and operating the controls of the plane himself. Now this is all speculative, but just an opinion here. I think to hit a precise target like the World Trade Center there and hit it right on the mark, that in this case you'd have to have the hijacker at the actual controls of the plane, because it's hard for me to imagine how you would force a pilot, even gun at his head or anything else, at the last moment. A single jerk of the plane's equipment could manage to miss the tower of the World Trade Center, perhaps go into the river, or imagine the Pentagon. You could go into a parking lot or an area right around there if you could jerk the yoke of the plane at the last moment. So I'm guessing that it's much more likely that the hijackers somehow disabled the crew and took over the control of these planes. But we may know eventually, because presumably the cockpit voice recorder has survived on each of these 4 airplanes. And the cockpit voice recorder would give you the actual conversation in the cockpit. And sometimes you can't precisely reconstruct what went on from what's being said back and forth, but the cockpit voice recorders of those 4 planes should give you at least everything that was said in the cockpits.
You're watching live NBC coverage of the terrorist attacks on New York City and Washington, D.C. This is KCRA-TV, Sacramento.
We said all the domestic planes had landed, and we now hear that there are 10 to 12 international flights, all of them bound into the West Coast, so presumably they were on the long Pacific run, or else the even longer Europe to the West Coast run. The 10 to 12 international flights still in the air. That's the last of it. All the domestic flights, as we'd said before, have landed.
All right, thanks, NBC's Robert Hager. We're going to go right now to, here's an update. The NBC affiliate in Omaha, Nebraska says that Air Force One has landed at Offutt Air Force Base, which is the headquarters of the Strategic Air Command. It's just south and east of Omaha. That is a place that the president very likely would go. It could not be more secure. They have a long landing pattern there and clear area all around them. And of course, they've got one of the most secure bunkers anywhere in the world. It was the critical part of our Cold War strategy. The Strategic Air Command bunker, as I recall, having been down there, it's about 6 stories beneath the ground, and it is heavily reinforced, and it has all the communications that you can possibly imagine. That, it does appear, is where the president is going to be for the time being, at least, until they sort out whether this wave of attacks is over. The Strategic Air Command is been removed from our consciousness a lot because of the end of the Cold War, but now we know what the consequences are of having one war over and another begin. This is an act of terrorism that has occurred here today. We're going to go to Pat Dawson now as we look at these scenes of what it's like in lower Manhattan. The phrase nuclear winter has been used again and again, and it's not inappropriate. Pat?
No, it's not, Tom. Certainly, I can tell you that when we were standing just about 2 or 3 blocks south of here at that bridge that you can see down there, probably at that point about 6, 7, 8 blocks north of the World Trade Center this morning when that tower went down and the smoke literally billowed and the dust up the avenue. It was precisely like the movies that we have seen. Much of this is like movies. It is very, very hard as a reporter. You know that the first thing you do is reach for something to make a comparison to, and frankly, through much of this, it's almost impossible for me to find things that are a satisfactory comparison. Let us try to find out now as much as we can. This is Inspector Gene Ciccarelli from the Port Authority Police. Inspector, if you can give us some sense at this point of how close you are able to get your rescue units in there.
We've been attempting to get our rescue units into the area. Unfortunately, there are areas that are under possibilities of collapsing. We're still searching a good portion of the perimeter, and as far as going in any further than that, we have to get a clearance to make sure that there is no potential danger for any further collapse that can endanger the rescue operation.
Now, just to explain to the people who may not know this, and certainly people outside New York who don't, there are 2 towers, or were, to be more accurate, 2 towers of the World Trade Center complex, yet there are still other fairly large office buildings as part of the complex, correct?
There are other what they call plaza buildings surrounding the 2 twin towers.
Right, and those are how big?
Some of them range from 20 stories, approximately 20 stories.
By the standards of much of America, that would be a skyscraper, quite frankly.
Well, I wouldn't put them on the
But
level.
still, they're rather large buildings. They're still standing there. Is that part of the threat that you perceive at this point?
Yes, there are those other plaza buildings that we are concerned about and do have the potential of collapsing. So, in answer to your question, it isn't wise to enter into that area at this point.
How would you describe your efforts to organize the rescue effort now, given that we saw a sequence of events this morning, a sequence of crashes, then explosions, and then the collapses? How close are you now, perhaps, to being able to organize an actual rescue effort to go in there and start going through the debris?
We still have, like I said, a concern about going in and initiating a rescue. If, in fact, there are other individuals there. We also have a very good operation in place at this time
to pool all of our resources together in one staging area, that we have a phenomenal amount of equipment and supplies that would assure us of any efforts that we make to continue with the rescue approach. But at this point, we do have a good group assembled for that purpose.
But at this point, presumably there may be a great number of people in there in need of rescue. Obviously, the problem for you is that if you go in to try to get them out, you put your rescuers in danger.
That's correct.
And no idea of when you might be in a position to actually say, we think it's safe to go in after them now.
No, until we get a firm clearance on that, we won't enter into an area that could be hazardous to people that are attempting to make the rescue.
Inspector, thank you very much for speaking to us. We appreciate it. Tom, the latest from the Port Authority Police here in New York City. As we've explained, they have jurisdiction over the World Trade Center complex. They, of course, are working in cooperation with a number of other police and rescue and fire agencies here, both local and federal, and essentially describing the quandary that they find themselves in, which is rather rare, certainly unique in the sense that we have seen the catastrophe repeatedly. We have seen through the morning 3 or 4 events which would qualify by anyone's description as catastrophes. It has now been probably a good 4 hours since the last one, but yet they still can't go in and begin a serious comprehensive rescue effort because they're worried about what might still be there, what danger might still lurk for the rescuers that have gone in. Tom?
Thank you very much, NBC's Pat Dawson. This terrorist war that has been declared on America today in New York City and Washington, D.C., and psychologically across the country has had such an enormous effect already. It has all but immobilized the largest nation in the world politically. There's been a severe realignment of where people can go and do their jobs in the nation's capital. Dennis Hastert, the House Speaker, was whisked out of his office. The President of the United States, we believe right now, is at the Strategic Air Command headquarters outside of Omaha. We don't know where Vice President Cheney is, except we're told that he's in a secure location. Don Rumsfeld is back at his desk in a more secure location. Secretary of State Colin Powell is on his way back from Peru. Then you have the economic consequences. The largest financial market in the world was shut down today. People were in peril in that immediate vicinity. Businesses across America are doing no business, my guess is. Certainly in the largest cities, so many of them have been shut down. All flights have been grounded at this point. And all baseball games have been suspended. The Seattle Space Needle was shut down. Walt Disney World was evacuated. In California, Knott's Berry Farm was evacuated, and a lot of other theme parks. All national monuments have been evacuated today as well. This country is on hold in shock and horror, and probably the beginning of a great deal of anger and frustration as well. We're told that all planes now that were in the air have landed safely. The domestic flights, there are still some international flights that are yet to come here. We'll have to deal with our shock and grief in the days to come, and there will be a realignment of this country in so many ways, the forms of which we cannot say now, because we're going to have to work this out together, individually, and certainly from our political and our economic institutions. But certainly there will be a change in security and a loss of innocence, especially for young people who have never been through anything quite like this. The most devastating attack since Pearl Harbor, some people saying worse than Pearl Harbor at this time. Let's go to Virginia Chow of NBC News, who was down in the area. Virginia, what was it like?
Well, Tom, you've already heard the unbelievable stories of people who survived, who are much closer to ground zero at the World Trade Center area. I was about 20 blocks north of that, and I witnessed the second tower collapsing. And what I observed, and what was amazing to me, were the reactions of the people as they watched this unfold around them. You have to remember that these are people who were streaming away from that area, who just minutes before were near the building or perhaps even in the building. And as I headed on foot going toward the World Trade Center, this was this morning when there was one tower still remaining. The first one had already collapsed. I was about 20 blocks north of there. There were thousands of people literally streaming toward me on foot trying to escape that area like refugees from a war zone. I was one of the lone people other than emergency personnel heading toward the area when we heard a rumble. People stopped, turned to look, and we watched in horror as the second tower came crashing down on itself. People screaming out, "Oh my God, oh my God, oh no." And immediately, very emotional, people crying in tears, realizing that there were hundreds, maybe thousands of people in and around that building who were going to be either badly hurt or killed. And I think that the emotional impact of this for people, even if they don't know anyone personally down there, has been devastating. Tom?
Thank you very much, Virginia Chow, who is one of the many NBC reporters who have gone beyond the call of duty today in the lower part of Manhattan. There is the scene. It was not a cruise missile. It was not a nuclear attack. It was a hijacked airliner used as a weapon directed at the World Trade Center. The Twin Towers both came down. We know that more than 100 people on the airliners were killed, and an untold number of people were killed or seriously wounded in and around that area. And as you look at these scenes from several hours after the planes hit the building and after the World Trade Center came down, you have some sense of the magnitude of the devastation. Jules Rennell is the manager of the World Trade Club at the World Trade Center. He, fortunately for him, was not there today. Mr. Rennell, how many people would be in the building, in your judgment, at 8:45 in the morning?
Probably somewhere around 20,000 people, Tom. A lot of the financial institutions like Cantor Fitzgerald and Morgan Stanley Dean Witter open early. So all those people would be in the building early, with the rest of the population coming in between 8:30 and 9:30.
Where were you when you heard about all this?
My son called me, and I came down and I turned on the television and saw the flames coming out of the building. And at that stage, recognized, the magnitude of what was happening. But in my wildest imagination, could never believe that those buildings could be destroyed. I mean, the Trade Center itself is like a small city. 35,000 people work there every day. Countless thousands of people visit the World Trade Center. The restaurant on top where I work, Windows on the World, is probably one of the most recognizable restaurants in the world. I just couldn't believe I was sitting here watching the buildings collapse. It was a nightmare.
How many people work in the World Trade Club itself?
We had about 40 people in Windows on the World in the club this morning. There was some kitchen crew in there. There were the accounting people, the banquet staff, some cleaning people, and they were prepping to open up for lunch at 12 o'clock in the greatest bar. We've been able to find some of the people through our network of telephones, but there are still a number of people that we haven't been able to find yet. Even though, the communication systems after the first bombing had improved dramatically with emergency lighting and back lights, etc., we just don't know if those people were able to get through the fire, which was below them as opposed to above them. So there are many, many people, many of our friends and colleagues that are not accounted for right now.
Mr. Rennell, I know this is a very difficult day for you, so I'll let you get about the business of trying to contact those people who work for you, and we thank you very much for being with us. Let's go to NBC's David Gregory. David, where's the president?
The president, Tom, has just arrived in Omaha, Nebraska at Offutt Air Force Base. There, he will convene a National Security Council meeting with the National Security team back in Washington via video conference, we are told. The president, you'll recall, left where I am, which is Sarasota, Florida, earlier today after making a statement about this attack at an education event, which was, of course, scrubbed. His intention at that point was to return to Washington promptly. Security concerns forced him to go to Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana, where he made another statement, and now to Nebraska. The White House is telling us he still intends and desires to go back to Washington as soon as he can, but again, security precautions are forcing the president to go to these various locations. Offutt Air Force Base, a secure location for him where he can go about the business of meeting with the National Security team. Vice President Cheney, as you have mentioned, running an operations center at or near the White House. We are not told for sure where he is, other than he's in a secure location. The president on Air Force One has contacted a number of the principals who are working in the rescue efforts, namely Mayor Giuliani, Governor Pataki of New York, and of course he has spoken to his wife, who was testifying on Capitol Hill, the First Lady Laura Bush, and the family's also been in touch with their daughters, who are also in a secure location now. Tom.
All right, thanks very much, NBC's David Gregory. We're also told that at Offutt Air Force Base, which is the home of the Strategic Air Command, there is the Doomsday plane. It was built to be flying White House for the president in case of nuclear attack. We think that that's where it is located. For a long time, you heard about the famous Looking Glass missions, B-52s in the air at all hours so that they could launch an attack if this country were ever attacked. The Dr. Strangelove movie scenario came out of all of that. No one ever anticipated that we would have a day quite like today in which the President of the United States would be forced to go to Offutt, the Strategic Air Command headquarters in the middle of America, because of an attack on the Pentagon and on New York City, and another plane that was hijacked and went into the ground outside of Pittsburgh. This was an all-out military assault under terrorist terms on the United States, innocent civilians used as weapons against other civilians, and also the United States Pentagon, which of course is emblematic of the United States military. So the United States government does have a series of contingency plans. Those are being put into effect. The president will have a national security meeting. I would guess the first order of business would be, what is the level of continuing threat against this country? What do we know about what may happen next, and who were these people, and how do we respond? Let's go to NBC's Robert Hager. Robert?
Tom, breathtaking, by the way, what that man from the World Trade Center said about 20,000 people supposed to be in there at that hour of the morning. So goodness knows where this toll is going. What we do know in terms of hard numbers are those killed on the various flights, so these airplanes that were turned into weapons. And that total is 266 in the 4 planes that were hijacked. 2 of the 4 were leaving Boston, and the other 2 leaving Newark and Washington's Dulles Airport. There you see the numbers adding up to 266. Planes turned into weapons, 2 of them into the World Trade Center, 1 into the Pentagon, and the other crashes before it reaches its intended target, crashes somewhere in rural Pennsylvania. U.S. air traffic at a standstill now. All airports in the U.S. closed to commercial traffic. No takeoffs, no landings permitted, with the exception that there are still 10 or 12 international flights that have yet to land on the West Coast. That situation at the U.S. airports will continue at least until noon tomorrow, and then a reassessment will be made at that point whether to begin reopening U.S. airlanes, but no word yet on whether that may happen or not. Simply that it's aground until noon tomorrow to all commercial flights, domestic and international. Tom?
All right, thanks very much, NBC's Robert Hager. Speaking of flights and people who are expected, Colin Powell is expected to land in Miami, Florida shortly. He was en route to Peru when he was turned around. The Secretary of State, it's not known if he will remain there or continue elsewhere. The president, as we have just been reporting, is in Omaha. The Vice President Dick Cheney in a secure but undisclosed location. Don Rumsfeld also working in a secure location. He was in the Pentagon when it was hit by that plane and rushed to the scene to assist with some of the rescue efforts that were being made. And then as this story began to unfold and people began to have an appreciation of the gravity and the magnitude of it beyond the first attack, then some extraordinary steps were being taken to make sure that the highest officials in the land were in secure places. No doubt that that was going on in financial institutions as well, especially given the location of the World Trade Center. And that has been going on around the world in most of the democracies. Certainly it's been true in Western Europe. Martin Fletcher is in Tel Aviv. On the West Bank, Palestinians were celebrating today, even though there was a strong statement from Yasser Arafat condemning this attack. What is the situation there now, Martin?
Well, yeah, some Palestinians were celebrating, about 3,000 in the West Bank town of Nablus, a few dozen in East Jerusalem, also in other West Bank towns, Kalkilia, Bethlehem, Tulkarm. They were celebrating until Palestinian police stopped it. They were throwing sweets in the air, giving out cakes. basically the attitude is that the United States, because of its firm support for Israel in the conflict with the Palestinians, their feeling is, well, America had it coming. But I should point out very strongly that the Palestinian leadership declared itself immediately shocked. Yasser Arafat called the attacks today in the United States unbelievable. But there are strong feeling in the street among some Palestinians that America did have it coming.
All right, Martin Fletcher, what has been the reaction from the Israeli government?
Well, very little. They said they don't want to say anything until they know exactly what happened. Of course, shock at what happened, shock at the killings. But there's a great sense that that when it's found out who did this, that there may be a very strong Middle East connection, of course, and Israel